Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the Neville family, the most powerful dynasty who ruled northern England for 3 centuries and made and unmade 3 kings. From their Anglo-Saxon origins in the mists of medieval Durham to their dramatic downfall in the reign of Elizabeth I, the Nevilles shaped the destiny of England through military triumph, strategic marriages, and political intrigue that would echo through the ages. We'll softly explore their remarkable rise from regional lords to kingmakers, from the Battle of Neville's Cross, where they captured a Scottish king, to the Wars of the Roses, where they decided who wore England's crown, and finally to their courageous but doomed rebellion that ended their dynasty forever, all while witnessing 3 centuries of English history unfold around their magnificent castle at Raby. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which member of the Neville family you find most fascinating, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from medieval England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. The Neville family, later known as the Kingmakers of medieval England, began their extraordinary journey not as Norman conquerors, but as survivors of an older world, a world of Anglo-Saxon England that existed before William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in that fateful year of 1066, while their surname would eventually sound French and noble. Speaking of Norman castles and feudal power, the truth of their origins lay deeper in the northern mists, rooted in the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, where Saxon earls once ruled from Durham to the Scottish border, commanding vast territories that had known independence and glory long before the Norman kings ever set foot on English soil. To understand the Nevilles, we must first understand the world they came from, a world that was already ancient when their story began, in the quiet hills of County Durham, where Roman walls still stood as reminders of even older empires, where the great monastery of Lindisfarne had once illuminated manuscripts that would survive the centuries, and where Saxon warriors had fought against Viking invaders in battles whose names were preserved only in poetry and song. There existed a continuity with England's pre-Norman past that was stronger in the north than anywhere else in the realm. The north of England in the 12th and 13th centuries was a place apart from the rest of the kingdom. Here, Saxon customs lingered longer. Saxon families held onto their lands more successfully, and the memory of the old independence burned more brightly. The great Plantagenet of Durham was ruled by prince-bishops who wielded powers that would elsewhere belong only to kings. They commanded armies, minted coins, held their own parliaments, and administered justice in courts that owed no authority to the crown. This was a region where local power mattered more than royal proclamations, where the harsh realities of border warfare against the Scots forged a warrior culture, and where families who could provide military service and defend the frontier were valued regardless of whether their names were Norman French or Anglo-Saxon. The story of the Nevilles began with a man whose very name hints at that forgotten Anglo-Saxon world, Uhtred. This was not an uncommon name in the north. Indeed, it appeared with regularity in the chronicles of Northumbria, carried by earls and nobles who had ruled these lands in the centuries before the conquest. The exact identity of the Uhtred who became ancestor of the Nevilles remains unclear, lost in those confused decades immediately following 1066, when surviving records were few and the old Saxon nobility struggled desperately to maintain their lands and titles under new Norman masters who had little respect for ancient English claims. What we know is that this Uhtred's descendants possessed a remarkable tenacity. While most Saxon landowners lost everything to Norman knights who arrived bearing royal charters and backed by armies, Uhtred's family managed to hold on to their estates in County Durham. They did this partly through adaptation, accepting Norman overlordship, serving the new kings faithfully, and gradually adopting Norman customs, but also through the simple fact that in the remote north, far from the centres of Norman power, Saxon families who could defend the land were too valuable to dispossess entirely. In later centuries, when the Nevilles had risen to great prominence and had the leisure to contemplate their ancestry, they would weave elaborate genealogies connecting themselves to the most illustrious bloodlines of both England and Scotland. These genealogies, compiled by family historians and heralds in the 15th and 16th centuries, claimed descent from Crinan of Dunkeld, who had been the lay abbot of Dunkeld in Scotland and the father of King Duncan III, making him the ancestor of the Scottish royal house of Dunkeld. Through Crinan, the genealogies traced a line back to the ancient Bamberg dynasty of Earls of Northumbria, those powerful magnates who had ruled the north in the 9th and 10th centuries, before England was even a unified kingdom. These claims attach the family's later power in the north to a pedigree of preeminence in the region stretching back at least as far as the early 10th century. Through the reigns of Elfred the Great's descendants, who had slowly united the various English kingdoms, through the Danish invasions when Northumbria had been conquered by Viking warriors, and through the eventual restoration of English rule when the kings of Wessex had extended their authority northward. Whether these genealogical claims were strictly accurate in every detail matters perhaps less than what they reveal about the family's sense of identity. The Nevilles saw themselves not as upstart Norman conquerors, but as inheritors of an ancient northern authority, descended from rulers who had held power in this region long before William the Bastard ever dreamed of the English crown. Modern genealogists have speculated about various theories to connect Uhtred with his purported forebears, attempting to trace the lineage through the fragmentary records that survive from the 11th and 12th centuries. But none of these theories is supported by any direct contemporary evidence. The written records simply do not exist to prove or disprove these ancient connections. What matters for our story is that the family believed in these connections, and so did many of their contemporaries. In an age when lineage and blood determined political power and social status, the Nevilles' claims to ancient Saxon nobility gave them a legitimacy that mere Norman descent could never have provided in the eyes of the northern population. What we can trace with more certainty begins in the year 1129, a date that marks the first definite appearance of the family in written records that survive to our time. In that year, the chronicles mention a man called Dolfin, and he is identified specifically as the son of Uhtred, connecting him directly to that mysterious ancestor. The name Dolfin itself is interesting. It is a Gaelic name, suggesting possible Scottish or Celtic connections, which would align with the family's later claims to Scottish royal ancestry. Dolfin appears in the records as holding the manor of Staindrop in County Durham, and this grant came from the Prior of Durham, one of the most powerful religious figures in all of northern England. The Priory of Durham, with its great cathedral church housing the shrine of St. Cuthbert, was perhaps the wealthiest and most influential monastery in the entire north. St. Cuthbert had been one of the most beloved saints of Anglo-Saxon England, a monk and bishop who had lived in the 7th century, and whose sanctity was demonstrated by the miracles attributed to him both during his life and after his death. His shrine at Durham attracted pilgrims from across Europe, and the offerings they made had enriched the monastery beyond measure. The Prior of Durham, as head of this great religious house, wielded enormous influence, and his patronage was something that secular lords coveted and competed for. Dolphin's grant from the prior included the manor of Staindrop itself, along with rights to common land that extended over some 14,000 acres, an enormous territory that shared boundaries with the vast church estates controlled by the monastery. Staindrop would remain the principal seat of the family for the next 440 years, until 1569, becoming the heart of Neville power and the site of their magnificent fortress at Raby. The very longevity of this connection to one place speaks to the family's deep roots in the region. They were not newcomers seeking to establish themselves, but descendants of an older order who had survived the conquest with their lands intact. The manor of Staindrop lay in a beautiful and strategic location. The land rolled gently through valleys and hills, with good soil for agriculture and extensive forests that provided timber for building and game for hunting. The River Tees ran not far to the north, providing both a natural boundary and a route for trade and communication. More importantly, the location was relatively secure from the constant Scottish raids that plagued the borderlands, far enough from the frontier to avoid the worst of the violence, but close enough to participate in border defence and benefit from the military culture that the Scottish threat created. Dolphin passed his lands and his position to his son Meldred, and the name here is again noteworthy. Meldred was unmistakably Anglo-Saxon in origin, demonstrating that 3 generations after the Norman conquest, this family was still proudly using English names rather than adopting Norman French ones. This was becoming increasingly unusual in an England where Norman culture and language were rapidly becoming dominant among the landowning classes, and it speaks to the family's determination to maintain their identity even as they adapted to Norman rule. Meldred in turn was succeeded by his son Robert Fitzmeldred, and here we see the beginning of a subtle shift. Fitzmeldred was a Norman-style surname meaning son of Meldred, showing that the family was beginning to adopt Norman naming conventions, even while preserving their English Christian names. Robert Fitzmeldred appears in records from the mid-12th century, and already he was recognised as a major power in County Durham. A contemporary account provides us with a valuable assessment of the family's position before they took the Neville name. The chronicler noted that in the extent of their landed possessions, this family, holding stubbornly to native English names for a full 100 years after 1066, was preeminent among the lay proprietors within the bishopric of Durham during the 12th century. This is high praise indeed. To be described as preeminent among all the secular landowners in Durham was to be recognised as one of the most powerful families in the entire region. While the great earls and barons might have more prestigious titles, and while the prince-bishops of Durham wielded ultimate authority among the landed gentry and lesser nobility, the ancestors of the Nevilles stood first. This position had been achieved not through royal favour or lucky marriages, at least not yet, but through 3 generations of careful management, military service, and political acumen. The family had grown steadily wealthier through efficient administration of their estates, developing their agricultural lands, establishing markets and mills, and collecting rents and feudal dues from their tenants. They had also avoided the rebellions and political missteps that had destroyed other Saxon families in the chaotic early years of Norman rule. When other nobles had risen in futile rebellions against William the Conqueror and his sons, this family had chosen survival over pride, accepting Norman overlordship and providing the military service required of them. The transformation that would give the family their famous name came in the early 13th century, in the lifetime of Robert Fitzmeldred's son, Geoffrey, who was born around 1187 at Raby. Geoffrey inherited not only his father's estates, but also those of his mother's family. And it is his mother who brings us to the crucial moment in the family's transformation. The identity of Geoffrey's mother has been the subject of scholarly debate for centuries, with different historians proposing different candidates. But what matters is that she came from a Norman family that bore the surname Neville. The Nevilles, from whom Geoffrey's mother descended, were a Norman family that had arrived in England with or shortly after William the Conqueror. They took their name from Neville in Normandy, and various branches of the Norman Neville family had established themselves in different parts of England. Some held lands in Essex, others in Lincolnshire, and at least one branch had settled in the north. When Geoffrey inherited his mother's estates in addition to his father's, he faced a choice that would determine the future of his family. He could have retained his father's name and style, continuing to be known as Geoffrey Fitzrobert, or using some variation of his father's Anglo-Saxon lineage. But Geoffrey made a calculated decision that would echo through the centuries. He adopted his mother's Norman surname of Neville, while retaining his father's coat of arms. This decision was not made lightly or arbitrarily. It reflected a clear-eyed assessment of the realities of power and social status in early 13th century England. In the England ruled by Norman kings, where Norman nobles dominated the court, where French was the language of government and law, and where Norman surnames carried automatic prestige, having a French name opened doors that remained firmly closed to those with English names, regardless of how ancient or legitimate their English ancestry might be. An ambitious young lord named Geoffrey Fitzrobert might be respected in County Durham, where people knew his family's history, but at the royal court in London or Winchester, he would be dismissed as a provincial Saxon of no particular importance. But Geoffrey de Neville, now that was a name that spoke of Norman heritage, that suggested connections to other Neville families scattered across England and Normandy, that implied belonging to the conquering class rather than the conquered. Yet Geoffrey was not simply abandoning his paternal heritage. The coat of arms he retained was his father's, and in medieval heraldry, the coat of arms was perhaps even more important than the surname as a mark of family identity. His arms bore the distinctive saltire argent on a field of gules, a red shield marked with a silver X-shaped cross. This saltire would become one of the most recognizable heraldic symbols in England, carried on banners into battles that would decide the fate of kingdoms, displayed on the walls of castles from Durham to London, and emblazoned on the tombs of some of the most powerful nobles England would ever know. The choice to retain his father's arms while taking his mother's name allowed Geoffrey to have it both ways, to claim Norman status and prestige through his surname while maintaining continuity with his Anglo-Saxon roots through his heraldry. It was a masterpiece of political and social calculation, typical of the adaptability that would characterize the family throughout their history. The Nevilles would always be skilled at reading the political moment and making the adjustments necessary for survival and advancement, even when those adjustments required uncomfortable changes. The estates that Geoffrey brought together through this inheritance were substantial and strategically located. The lands from his father included the manor of Staindrop and surrounding territories, along with rights and privileges that had been accumulated over generations. From his mother came additional manors and lordships, possibly including lands in Lincolnshire, where some branches of the Norman Neville family held property. Most importantly, the inheritance included Raby itself, where his ancestors had built their stronghold on a site associated with power since time immemorial. The exact origins of Raby Castle are lost in the mists of history, but legend and tradition associated the site with King Canute, the Danish king who had ruled England from 1016 to 1035. Whether or not Canute actually built a palace at Raby is impossible to prove from surviving evidence, but the story itself is significant. It suggests that even before the conquest, Raby was recognized as a seat of royal or near royal power. The location was superb for a fortress, situated on raised ground with good lines of sight, defendable against attack, with access to fresh water and surrounded by fertile agricultural land that could support a large household and garrison. In Geoffrey's time, the castle at Raby was probably not yet the great fortress we can see today. That magnificent structure would be built by his descendants in the 14th century. Instead, Geoffrey's Raby was likely a typical manor house of the period, constructed primarily of timber rather than stone, with earthwork defences and perhaps a wooden palisade. But even in this early form, Raby was the administrative centre of the family's power, the place where rents were collected, justice was administered, military forces were mustered, and the lord received visitors and vassals who came to seek his favour or fulfil their feudal obligations. Geoffrey de Neville, as he now styled himself, married and established his own family, producing sons who would continue the male line and daughters who could be married advantageously to create alliances with other powerful families. His eldest son and heir was Robert de Neville, and it is with Robert that we see the family beginning to assume positions of real authority beyond their local territory in Durham. Robert de Neville was appointed to serve as Sheriff of Yorkshire in 1258, and also as Sheriff of Northumberland. These positions represented an enormous expansion of the family's power and influence. The office of Sheriff in medieval England was one of the most important positions of local government. The Sheriff was the king's representative in the county, responsible for collecting royal revenues, enforcing royal justice, summoning men for military service, and maintaining order. To be appointed sheriff of not just one, but 2 counties meant that Robert de Neville had proven himself trustworthy and competent in the eyes of the king, and that he now wielded royal authority over a vast territory extending from the Scottish border down through Yorkshire. This appointment also marked the beginning of a pattern that would characterize the family for the next 2 centuries. The Nevilles would hold royal office frequently and skillfully, using their positions to enhance their wealth, extend their influence, and make themselves indispensable to the crown. Every king needed reliable men in the north who could be trusted to defend the border against the Scots, to collect revenues efficiently, and to maintain order among the quarrelsome northern gentry. The Nevilles proved themselves excellent at all these tasks, and they were rewarded accordingly. Robert de Neville's importance is also demonstrated by his role in the great political crisis of the 1260s, when England was torn by civil war between King Henry III and a coalition of rebellious barons led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. Simon de Montfort has been celebrated by some historians as a champion of parliamentary government and constitutional reform, but in his own time, he was a controversial figure who had led a rebellion against his king and effectively held Henry III as a captive while ruling England in the king's name. The Montfortian rebellion divided English noble families, with some supporting the reformers and others remaining loyal to the king. Robert de Neville chose loyalty to King Henry III, fighting on the royal side against the baronial rebels. This was not necessarily an obvious choice. The rebels were powerful and for several years appeared to be winning, but it proved to be the right one. When Henry's son, the Lord Edward, later King Edward I, finally defeated the rebels at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, killing Simon de Montfort and restoring royal authority, those families who had remained loyal to the crown were remembered and rewarded. Robert de Neville's loyalty during the crisis helped establish the family's reputation as supporters of royal authority, a reputation that would serve them well in the generations to come. Robert had several sons who survived to adulthood, and he made provisions for each of them, following the medieval practice of trying to ensure that all sons had some landed income, even if the bulk of the inheritance went to the eldest. Another son named Geoffrey was given lands and established what would become a cadet branch of the family at Hornby in Lancashire, while other sons named John and Hugh received smaller portions of the family estates. These younger sons and their descendants would remain connected to the main Neville line through bonds of kinship and mutual interest, occasionally intermarrying with the senior line and generally supporting the family's interests across the north. The family's wealth and power continued to grow steadily through the late 13th and early 14th centuries, through a carefully balanced strategy that combined military service, administrative competence, strategic marriages, and simple good management of their estates. Their regional dominance benefited greatly from their frequent appointment to royal offices. Beyond the sheriffdoms, members of the family served as castellans, commanders of royal castles, as justices of the forest, officials responsible for enforcing the complex and harsh laws governing the royal forests where only the king could hunt, and as justices of the peace, positions that gave them authority to hear legal cases and maintain order in their districts. This prominent office holding created a beneficial cycle. Royal service brought income from fees and perquisites, enhanced the family's prestige and authority, provided opportunities to grant favors and build networks of clients and dependents, and demonstrated to the king that the family was both loyal and competent, leading to more appointments and greater responsibilities. A family that held the sheriffdom of Yorkshire could influence which men were appointed to lesser offices throughout the county, could ensure that royal justice was administered in ways that favoured family interests and those of their allies, and could use the resources of the office to enrich themselves and their supporters. The Nevilles also held administrative office under the Prince-Bishops of Durham, those unique prelates who ruled their palatinate with powers that elsewhere belonged only to kings. The Bishops of Durham were not merely spiritual leaders, but temporal princes who commanded their own military forces, maintained their own law courts, collected their own taxes, and exercised authority that was independent of the king in many respects. The historical origins of this unusual situation lay in the dangerous position of Durham on the frontier with Scotland. Medieval kings had granted the bishops extraordinary powers because they needed strong, reliable authority in the region, and the bishops, with their vast monastic resources and the spiritual authority of St. Cuthbert's shrine, were well positioned to provide that authority. Service to the bishops of Durham brought benefits similar to those of royal service: income, prestige, and influence, but it also created potential complications. What happened when the interests of the bishop conflicted with those of the king? The Nevilles generally managed to maintain good relations with both the bishops and the crown, performing a delicate balancing act that required considerable diplomatic skill. They understood that their power in the north rested on maintaining the favour of multiple overlords, and they became expert at navigating these sometimes conflicting loyalties. Robert de Neville's grandson, another Ralph Neville, achieved a signal honour in 1295 when he was summoned to sit in the newly established House of Lords, becoming one of the founding members of the peerage of England. This summons to Parliament was tremendously significant. It marked the family's formal entry into the highest ranks of the English nobility, transforming them from important regional gentry into parliamentary barons with a hereditary right to advise the king in the great council of the realm. The establishment of Parliament as a regular institution of English government in the late 13th century represented a major constitutional development, creating a formal structure through which the king consulted with his leading subjects. Edward III, who convened the first fully representative parliament in 1295, known to history as the Model Parliament, understood that effective government required the cooperation of the nobility, and he institutionalized that cooperation by creating a body where nobles could voice their concerns, offer advice, and consent to taxation. The men summoned to this first parliament and their male descendants would form the English peerage, a hereditary aristocracy with specific legal rights and privileges. Ralph Neville's summons initiated what would be called the line of barons, Neville de Raby being added to distinguish this branch of the Neville family from other branches who bore the same surname. The title of baron was not yet as clearly defined as it would become in later centuries. There were barons who held their baronies by ancient tenure, barons created by royal charter, and barons by writ, those who had received a summons to Parliament. Ralph fell into this third category, and his barony became hereditary when his son received a similar summons. Being a parliamentary baron brought not only prestige, but also responsibilities and burdens. Barons were expected to attend Parliament when summoned, to provide military service to the king with a specified number of knights and men-at-arms, to pay feudal dues and taxes, and to serve on royal councils and commissions. In return, they enjoyed precedence in social rank, the right to trial by their peers rather than in ordinary courts, and the opportunity to influence royal policy through their collective voice in Parliament. Ralph Neville and his immediate successors served the crown faithfully in the wars of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, conflicts that would prove crucial in further enhancing the family's standing and reputation. The Scottish Wars of Independence, which began in 1296 when Edward I invaded Scotland and attempted to assert English overlordship, would rage intermittently for decades, creating opportunities for northern families to demonstrate their military prowess and their loyalty to the English crown. These wars were brutal and bitter, fought with a ferocity born of national pride and religious fervour on both sides. The Scots, led first by William Wallace and then by Robert the Bruce, fought for their independence with desperate courage, while the English, under Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III, sought to complete what they saw as the natural unification of the British Isles under English rule. The border region became a wasteland of burned villages, slaughtered populations, and shifting allegiances as the tide of war flowed back and forth across the frontier. For the Nevilles, with their vast estates in County Durham and their responsibilities as wardens of the border, these wars placed them literally in the front lines of national defense. They were not distant from the fighting, able to observe battles from the safety of their southern estates. They were there in the midst of it, raising troops from their tenants, maintaining fortifications, gathering intelligence about Scottish movements, and leading armies into battle against the forces of Wallace, Bruce, and their successors. The constant warfare brought dangers, but also opportunities. Victory in battle brought glory and enhanced reputation. Capturing enemy nobles brought ransoms that could make a commander wealthy. Success in defending the border brought royal gratitude and further grants of land and office. The military culture of the northern nobility became increasingly important to their identity. These were warrior families, tested in battle, whose power ultimately rested on their ability to lead men in combat and to defend their lands against invaders. In 1334, Ralph Neville, the second Lord of Raby, the grandson of the man who had been summoned to the first Parliament, was appointed as one of the wardens of the marches, those crucial positions responsible for defending England's northern frontier against Scottish incursions. The wardenship of the marches was perhaps the most important military office in northern England, carrying enormous responsibility and substantial power. The wardens commanded the border forces, negotiated truces with Scottish commanders, coordinated defence against raids, and sometimes led major military expeditions into Scotland itself. The appointment of Ralph Neville as warden marked the beginning of what would become virtually a hereditary connection between the Neville family and this office. For the next 2 centuries, the Nevilles would habitually hold warderships of the marches, making the defence of the border almost synonymous with the Neville name. This position brought both burdens and benefits. Wardens had to maintain military readiness at all times, had to respond quickly to Scottish raids that could occur without warning, and bore responsibility for the security of a vast and vulnerable frontier. But wardenship also brought substantial revenues from customs duties collected on cross-border trade, extensive judicial powers over the border population, and immense prestige as the king's chief military representatives in the north. The constant necessity of defending the border created a military infrastructure that the Nevilles controlled. They maintained networks of scouts and spies who could provide early warning of Scottish movements. They kept fortified towers and castles ready to receive populations fleeing from raids. They mustered and trained forces of knights, men-at-arms, and archers, who could be mobilized quickly when danger threatened. They negotiated with the Scottish wardens on the other side of the border, sometimes arranging temporary truces and sometimes coordinating joint actions against cross-border criminals who plagued both sides. All of this activity required resources, and the Nevilles used their wealth and their authority to build a system that made them indispensable to English security in the north. No king could afford to alienate a family that controlled such crucial defences. Even when individual Nevilles fell out of favour or backed the wrong side in political conflicts, the family as a whole remained too important to destroy. England needed the Nevilles to guard the north, and the Nevilles understood and exploited this necessity with great skill. The family also began to prove their military prowess in the 100 Years' War with France, that long conflict that would dominate English foreign policy from 1337 to 1453, and would consume enormous resources while bringing glory to the English nobility. Service in France offered opportunities different from but complementary to those available on the Scottish border. The wars in France were fought on a grand scale, with enormous armies, complex strategies, and battles that became legendary: Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. English nobles who distinguished themselves in France won fame that echoed across Europe. The Nevilles, like other ambitious families, sent their sons to fight in the great campaigns in France, building reputations as skilled military commanders and gaining experience in different styles of warfare. The lessons learned in France, the devastating effectiveness of longbow archers, the importance of choosing good defensive positions, the value of discipline and coordination, would prove invaluable when applied to battles fought later in England during the Wars of the Roses. The military expertise that the family accumulated through generations of warfare in Scotland and France would make them among the most formidable military families in England when civil war finally came. But perhaps the single most important moment in establishing the Neville reputation, the battle that would give the family lasting glory and demonstrate to all England their military prowess, still lay ahead in that autumn of 1346. The autumn of 1346 brought the Neville family their greatest military glory and secured their reputation as the indispensable defenders of northern England. But to understand this triumph, we must first understand the complex web of international politics and military strategy that brought two armies face to face on that October day outside the walls of Durham. The story begins not in England at all, but across the Channel in France, where King Edward III was pursuing his audacious claim to the French throne through military conquest, setting in motion a chain of events that would reach all the way to the north of England. Edward III of England was one of the most martial and ambitious kings ever to sit on the English throne. Crowned in 1327, at the age of 14, after his mother and her lover had forced his father Edward II to abdicate, young Edward had spent his teenage years nominally ruling, while powerful nobles actually controlled the government. But in 1330, at the age of 17, Edward had staged a dramatic coup, arresting his mother's lover Roger Mortimer in Nottingham Castle and assuming personal control of the kingdom. From that moment, Edward proved himself a king of remarkable energy, political skill, and military talent. In 1337, Edward had laid claim to the throne of France through his mother Isabella, who had been the daughter of King Philip IV of France. The French denied this claim, citing Salic law which supposedly barred inheritance through the female line, and they had instead crowned Philip VI as king. Edward refused to accept this verdict, and what began as a diplomatic dispute rapidly escalated into open warfare as Edward invaded France, initiating what would later be known as the 100 Years' War. Though neither Edward nor his contemporaries knew that they were starting a conflict that would drag on for more than a century and devastate France. The early years of the war had been marked by dramatic English successes. Edward's ships had destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of Sluys in 1340, giving England control of the Channel and allowing Edward to move his armies across the sea at will. Campaigns in Brittany and Gascony had expanded English-controlled territory in France, but the greatest English triumph came in the summer of 1346, when Edward launched a major invasion of northern France, with an army that contemporary chroniclers estimated at anywhere from 10 to 15,000 men, a huge force by medieval standards. Edward landed his army in Normandy in July 1346, and began a devastating march across the French countryside. English soldiers burned villages, plundered towns, and spread terror wherever they went. This was not merely random destruction. It was a calculated strategy known as the chevauchée, designed to demonstrate that the French king could not protect his own people, to destroy the economic resources that supported the French war effort, and to draw the French army into battle where Edward's forces could destroy them. The strategy worked. After laying waste to much of Normandy and moving north toward Flanders, Edward found his path blocked by the River Somme, with the French army under King Philip VI in pursuit. A desperate search for a crossing point succeeded at the ford of Blanchetaque, where Edward's army waded across the river just ahead of the pursuing French forces. The English then took up a defensive position on a slope near the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, choosing their ground carefully and arranging their forces in 3 divisions with masses of longbow archers on the flanks. On August 26, 1346, the French army arrived, and despite the lateness of the day and the exhaustion of their troops, who had been marching hard in pursuit of the English, Philip ordered an immediate attack. What followed was a massacre that shocked all of Europe and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of English military tactics. The French attacked in waves, with Genoese crossbowmen in the vanguard, followed by masses of heavily armoured cavalry, carrying lances and banners displaying the arms of France's greatest noble families. The English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks of the English formations, began shooting as soon as the French came within range. These were not ordinary archers. They were professional soldiers who had trained since childhood to use the immensely powerful English longbow, a weapon that could drive an arrow through armour at close range and that could be shot with terrifying rapidity. A skilled longbowman could lose 10 or 12 arrows per minute, and Edward had thousands of them on the field that day. The arrows fell among the French like deadly rain. The Genoese crossbowmen, their weapons outranged and outshot by the English longbows, broke and fled after the first volleys. only to be ridden down by their own cavalry, who regarded their retreat as cowardice. The French knights charged again and again throughout the afternoon and evening, wave after wave of the finest cavalry in Europe hurling themselves at the English position, only to be shot down by the archers before they could close with the English men-at-arms. By the time darkness finally ended the slaughter, thousands of French nobles and soldiers lay dead on the slope, including the blind King John of Bohemia, who had insisted on being led into the battle tied to his knights despite his blindness, and 11 French princes and counts. The victory at Crécy was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed to prove the superiority of English military tactics over French chivalric tradition. The longbow, which could be wielded by common yeomen and required no expensive armour or noble birth, had defeated the flower of French knighthood. Edward's reputation soared across Europe, and the English army moved north to besiege the important port city of Calais, which controlled access to the Channel and would serve as England's gateway to France for centuries to come. But Edward's very success in France created dangers for England itself. King Philip VI of France, humiliated by the disaster at Crécy and desperate to relieve the English siege of Calais, turned to France's oldest ally, Scotland. The relationship between France and Scotland, known as the Auld Alliance, dated back to 1295 and was based on a simple strategic calculation. Both nations feared England and could benefit from coordinating their military actions. When England attacked France, Scotland would invade northern England, forcing the English to fight on two fronts and dividing their forces. When England threatened Scotland, France would create diversions on the continent, relieving pressure on the Scots. In the summer of 1346, as Edward was preparing to invade France, Philip had already sent appeals to King David II of Scotland, asking him to honour the Auld Alliance and to attack England from the north as soon as Edward's army left for France. Philip's request became increasingly desperate after Crécy, as he realised that only a major Scottish invasion could force Edward to abandon the siege of Calais and return to defend his own kingdom. David II of Scotland, who had been born in 1324 and was now a young man of 22, felt deep obligations to France. David's father had been the legendary Robert the Bruce, who had won Scotland's independence through decades of warfare culminating in his great victory at Bannockburn in 1314. But Robert's death in 1329 had been followed by years of chaos in Scotland. The English had supported Edward Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne, leading to renewed warfare, and the young David had been forced to flee to France for safety when he was only 7 years old. He had spent 7 years in exile, living at the French court, under the protection of King Philip, and he had only returned to Scotland in 1341, when he was 17. David thus felt genuine gratitude to France for sheltering him during his youth, and he was inclined to honour the Auld Alliance even without Philip's urgent appeals. Moreover, David's position in Scotland was not entirely secure. There were Scottish nobles who resented his authority, and Edward Balliol still claimed to be the rightful king of Scotland with English backing. A successful military campaign into England could strengthen David's position at home, allow him to distribute plunder and lands to his supporters, and demonstrate that he was a worthy successor to his legendary father. In early October 1346, after receiving particularly desperate pleas from Philip following the disaster at Crécy, David assembled a formidable Scottish army at Perth. Contemporary estimates of the size of this army vary considerably, as is typical with medieval sources, but most chroniclers agree that David gathered somewhere between 10 and 15,000 men, one of the largest Scottish armies assembled in many years. This was not merely a raiding party of bored arrivals looking for plunder, but a genuine military expedition with serious strategic objectives. The Scottish army that marched south from Perth represented a cross-section of Scottish society united in arms. At its core were the great lords and their retinues, men like John Randolph, Earl of Moray, who had recently returned from France and brought with him French advisors and possibly some French soldiers, Maurice de Moravia, Earl of Strathearn, Patrick Dunbar, Earl of March, and numerous lesser nobles, each leading contingents of armoured cavalry, men-at-arms on foot, and archers. The Scottish nobility had learned from bitter experience in their wars with England, and they no longer relied solely on traditional Scottish pike formations, but had adopted more flexible tactics. Below the nobility came the professional soldiers, men-at-arms who made their living by warfare, experienced fighters who had seen action in the border raids that were a constant feature of Anglo-Scottish relations. These men wore whatever armour they could afford, carried a variety of weapons from swords and axes to spears and daggers, and knew their business thoroughly. They were tough, hard men accustomed to the brutal realities of medieval warfare, where mercy was rare and death came quickly to the defeated. Finally came the common soldiers, the levies raised from the Scottish countryside, men who were farmers or craftsmen in peacetime, but who owed military service to their lords. These men were less well-equipped and less experienced than the professional soldiers, but they knew how to use their weapons, spears, bows, axes, whatever they possessed, and they fought with the ferocity of men defending their homes and families. Scottish pride and hatred of the English, built up through decades of warfare and English attempts to subjugate Scotland, gave them courage that more experienced soldiers might have lacked. David's scouts had reported that England's defences in the north were weak. With King Edward and the English army in France, it appeared that the north was defended only by whatever forces the local lords could raise, perhaps supplemented by older men, clergy, and hastily assembled militia. The Scots believed that they could march deep into English territory, burn and plunder at will, and return to Scotland laden with booty before any substantial English force could be assembled to stop them. It seemed an opportunity too good to miss. The Scottish army crossed the border into England on October 7, 1346, and immediately began a campaign of systematic destruction. The first days of the invasion were marked by the ruthless violence typical of medieval border warfare. The Scots swept through Northumberland, burning villages, driving off livestock, and killing anyone who resisted. Churches and monasteries, which might normally have been spared on religious grounds, were particular targets because they contained wealth, precious vessels, vestments, and other valuables that could be carried away as plunder. At Little Peel, a small fortified tower in Cumbria, the Scots demonstrated their determination and ruthlessness. The tower was held by a small English garrison who refused to surrender, trusting in their strong walls to protect them. The Scots stormed the tower, overcoming the defenders, and then massacred everyone inside, men, women, and children. Medieval chroniclers would later cite this massacre as evidence of Scottish barbarism, though the reality was that such atrocities were common on both sides during the bitter warfare between England and Scotland. The Scottish army then moved toward Carlisle, one of the major English cities in the northwest. Carlisle was strongly fortified with thick stone walls and a substantial garrison, and David recognized that attempting to storm the city would be costly and time-consuming. Instead, according to some accounts, the Scots negotiated with the city authorities and agreed to bypass Carlisle in exchange for a payment, essentially a bribe or protection money. Whether this transaction actually occurred is debated by historians, but Carlisle was indeed spared, and the Scottish army moved eastward across the Pennines toward Durham. The next major target was Hexham Abbey, one of the great monastic houses of northern England. Founded in the 7th century on the site where St. Wilfrid had established a monastery, Hexham had been rebuilt and enlarged over the centuries, and by 1346 was a wealthy establishment with extensive lands, a famous library, and treasures accumulated through centuries of donations from pious benefactors. The abbey also possessed significant political influence in the region and was closely connected to the bishops of Durham. The Scots attacked Hexham Abbey on October 14, 1346, and what followed was an orgy of destruction that would be remembered for generations. The monks, who had been warned of the Scottish approach, had hidden or removed some of their most precious treasures, but much remained when the Scots arrived. Scottish soldiers forced their way into the abbey church, stripping the altars of their gold and silver vessels, tearing down ornate decorations, and searching every corner for hidden valuables. The abbey's library, containing precious manuscripts, some of which dated back to the early medieval period, was ransacked, with some volumes carried away and others carelessly destroyed. The chroniclers who recorded the sack of Hexham wrote with genuine horror at the sacrilege committed by the Scots. They described how the Scottish soldiers showed no respect for the sanctity of the church, desecrating altars, mocking the sacred vessels, and treating the abbey as merely another target for plunder. Whether the Scots actually committed all the specific outrages attributed to them by English chroniclers is questionable. Medieval writers routinely exaggerated the crimes of their enemies, but there is no doubt that Hexham suffered terribly. The financial losses alone were devastating, setting back the abbey's economic position for decades. From Hexham, the Scottish army moved southeast toward Durham, the greatest prize in the north of England. Durham was not merely a city, but a symbol, the shrine of St. Cuthbert, the seat of a prince-bishop who ruled his palatinate like a king, and the spiritual heart of northern England. The cathedral that housed Cuthbert's shrine was one of the finest Romanesque churches in Europe, its massive pillars and soaring arches representing the power and permanence of Christian civilization. For the Scots to sack Durham would be a triumph that would echo across England and Europe. By October 16th, the Scottish army had reached the outskirts of Durham and made camp in the bishop's great deer park of Beaufort, just 2 miles northwest of the city walls. The park covered hundreds of acres and provided the Scots with a defensible position, fresh water, and space for their large army. From their camp, the Scots could see the cathedral rising above the city on its rocky promontory, surrounded by the River Wear on 3 sides, a naturally defensible position that had been the site of Christian worship since the 7th century. The monks of Durham Cathedral Priory found themselves in a desperate situation. Their city was surrounded by a hostile army that had already demonstrated its willingness to destroy religious establishments. The monks had to consider not only their own safety, but also the safety of the precious shrine of St. Cuthbert, which contained the saint's incorrupt body along with countless treasures donated by pilgrims over the centuries. The loss or desecration of the shrine would be a catastrophe, not just for Durham, but for all of northern England, where Cuthbert was the most beloved saint. The prior of Durham, the head of the monastic community, made a pragmatic decision. Rather than wait for the Scots to attack, he sent messengers to David II's camp, offering to pay a ransom of £1,000 to protect the cathedral, the city, and the shrine from being sacked. £1,000 was an enormous sum, the equivalent of several million pounds in modern money. But the monks judged it a price worth paying to preserve the shrine and avoid the destruction that had befallen Hexham. David VI's Khan agreed to this proposal. He set the payment date for October 18th, giving the monks 2 days to gather the money. This agreement seemed to promise that Durham would be spared, and the Scottish army settled into their camp at Beaufort to await their payment. The Scots distributed guards to prevent undisciplined soldiers from breaking the truce and raiding the city, and they prepared to enjoy a comfortable rest before beginning their march back to Scotland laden with the plunder they had already collected. But King David and his commanders had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated the capacity and determination of northern England to defend itself, and they had failed to account for 3 men who had been quietly preparing a response to the invasion: Henry Percy, Ralph Neville, and William de la Zouche, Archbishop of York. These 3 officials bore responsibility for defending the north, and they had no intention of allowing the Scots to devastate the region unopposed. The defence of northern England in 1346 rested primarily on 3 men, whose positions, personalities, and interests would determine the English response to the Scottish invasion. Each of these men brought different resources and motivations to the crisis, but they shared a common determination to defend their region and to stop the Scots before they could do more damage. Henry Percy, who held the title of 2nd Baron Percy, was head of the Percy family, the other great power in the north alongside the Nevilles. The Percys held vast estates centred on Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, and they had been warriors on the Scottish border for generations. Henry Percy was an experienced soldier who had fought in numerous skirmishes and raids along the border, and he understood Scottish tactics and capabilities thoroughly. He had a personal stake in stopping this invasion. His own lands in Northumberland had been devastated by the Scottish advance. His tenants had been killed or driven from their homes, and his honour as a border lord demanded that he respond. The Percy family's relationship with the Nevilles was complex and would become increasingly troubled in later generations, eventually erupting into the bitter Percy-Neville feud that would destabilise the north in the 15th century. But in 1346, whatever tensions existed between the families were subordinated to the common necessity of defending against the Scottish threat. Percy and Neville would work together in this crisis, pooling their resources and coordinating their forces to confront the invaders. Ralph Neville, the 2nd Baron Neville de Raby, was the grandson of the Ralph Neville who had been summoned to the First Parliament in 1295, and he had inherited both his grandfather's title and his military responsibilities. Ralph was serving as one of the wardens of the marches, making him directly responsible for border defence, and the Scottish invasion represented both a challenge to his authority and an opportunity to demonstrate his military prowess. He was a man at the height of his powers, probably in his 40s, with years of experience in border warfare and intimate knowledge of the terrain where the coming battle would be fought. Ralph understood that this Scottish invasion was different from the usual border raids. David II had brought a proper army, not just a raiding party, and his objectives went beyond simple plunder. If David could devastate Durham and force the English to pay him to leave, it would be a humiliating blow to English prestige and would encourage future Scottish aggression. Ralph knew that the Scots had to be met and defeated in battle, and he was determined to command the English forces that would accomplish this. The third key figure was William de la Zouche, who held the crucial position of Archbishop of York, the second most important churchman in England after the Archbishop of Canterbury, and who also served as warden of the Eastern March. The combination of ecclesiastical and military responsibilities in one person was not unusual in medieval England, where bishops and archbishops frequently led armies and participated in warfare. De la Zouche was a capable administrator and military organizer who understood that the Scottish invasion threatened not just secular interests, but the church itself, as demonstrated by the sack of Hexham Abbey. As archbishop, de la Zouche had resources that secular lords could not match. He could call upon the revenues of the vast Archbishopric of York, one of the wealthiest ecclesiastical territories in England. He could summon the military forces owed by the church estates scattered across Yorkshire. He could offer spiritual incentives to soldiers, promises of absolution for sins committed in defence of England, prayers for those who fell in battle, and the blessing of the church on the English cause. His participation in the campaign would give it a religious dimension, transforming it from merely a military operation into a holy war, to defend Christian England against Scottish invaders who had desecrated churches. These three men, Percy, Neville, and de la Zouche, had been aware of the Scottish invasion from its beginning. The border was never truly quiet, and both the English and Scottish sides maintained networks of scouts, spies, and informants who could provide early warning of major troop movements. When David began assembling his army at Perth, English agents had observed and reported it. When the Scots crossed the border on October 7th, messengers had immediately ridden south to alert the English authorities. The problem facing the English commanders was time and numbers. With King Edward and the main English army in France, the forces available in the north were limited. They needed to gather men from across the northern counties, and this required days or even weeks of organising, sending out summons, waiting for lords to muster their retinues, and coordinating movement. The Scots, meanwhile, were already deep in English territory and moving freely. Archbishop de la Zouche took charge of organising the English response. He issued summons across Yorkshire, Lancashire, Cumberland, and Northumberland, calling on all men obligated to provide military service to assemble at Richmond in North Yorkshire with all possible speed. The response to this summons demonstrated the seriousness with which the northern population viewed the Scottish threat. Within days, an army began to gather at Richmond. The initial English force assembled by October 14th comprised approximately 4,000 men, drawn from the northern counties. Lancashire contributed a particularly important contingent, 1,200 longbowmen, those skilled archers whose weapons had just proven so devastating at Crécy. These Lancashire archers were professional soldiers, men who had trained with the longbow since boyhood and could shoot with deadly accuracy and remarkable speed. The presence of these archers would prove crucial in the coming battle. The English force also included contingents of armoured cavalry called hobelars, lighter cavalry than the heavy knights who formed the elite of medieval armies, but more mobile and versatile. Hobelars were mounted on smaller horses than knights' destriers, wore less armour, and were skilled at raiding, pursuit, and skirmishing. On the Scottish border, where quick response to raids was essential, hobelars were often more useful than heavily armoured knights who were slow to mobilise. In addition to the Lancashire troops and the hobelars, the army included retinues from the great northern lords. Percy brought his household knights and the men owed by his Northumberland estates. Neville brought the forces of County Durham, and lesser lords brought whatever men they could muster. These were not the dregs of society or reluctant peasants forced to fight, but experienced soldiers who knew what they were fighting for and understood the stakes involved. Many had personal grievances against the Scots, homes burned, relatives killed, property stolen, that gave them motivation beyond mere duty. Archbishop de la Zouche had to make a crucial decision as his forces assembled at Richmond. Intelligence reports indicated that the Scots were at Durham, and additional English forces were still marching from the southern parts of Yorkshire to join the army. De la Zouche could wait for these reinforcements, which would give him a larger army, but would also give the Scots more time to complete their devastation and possibly escape back to Scotland. Or he could march immediately with the forces he had, risking battle with an army that might be outnumbered but gaining the element of surprise. On October 14, the same day that the Scots were sacking Hexham Abbey, de la Zouche made his decision. He would not wait. He ordered his army to march immediately toward Durham. moving with remarkable speed to intercept the Scots. The English army moved first northwest toward Barnard Castle, then wheeled northeast toward Durham, following roads and tracks that the soldiers knew intimately. This was their homeland, and they moved with confidence across familiar terrain. The Yorkshire reinforcements joined the English army during the march, bringing the total English strength up to somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 men, still smaller than the Scottish army, but substantial enough to offer battle. At this point, Ralph Neville formally assumed overall command of the combined English forces, as one of the wardens of the marches, as the leading noble of County Durham, where the battle would be fought, and as an experienced military commander. Neville was the natural choice to lead. Percy and de la Zouche would command divisions of the army, but Neville would direct the overall strategy and make the crucial tactical decisions. Ralph Neville knew that he was about to fight the most important battle of his life. Success would bring glory, wealth from ransoms and plunder, and the gratitude of his king. Failure would mean not just military defeat, but the devastation of his own homeland. The Scottish army would be free to burn and plunder County Durham, possibly including Raby Castle itself. The shrine of St. Cuthbert, the most sacred site in the north, would be at the Scots' mercy. Everything Neville had inherited from his ancestors, everything he hoped to pass on to his descendants, depended on victory in the coming battle. As the English army approached Durham on the morning of October 17, 1346, Ralph Neville knew that the Scots were encamped at Beaufort, waiting to collect their ransom from the monks. The Scottish army was confident, relaxed, and probably unprepared for immediate battle. They expected to negotiate with monks, not fight English soldiers. This gave Neville a priceless advantage. He could choose when and where to offer battle, and he could do so when the Scots were not fully prepared. The decision to attack immediately, without even attempting negotiation or delay, was entirely in character for Ralph Neville and for the military culture of the medieval English nobility. Knights and nobles were trained from childhood to seek glory through martial prowess, and the opportunity to defeat a Scottish army led by their king was too valuable to waste on diplomatic niceties. Moreover, the religious dimension of the conflict, the Scots had desecrated churches, including the great abbey at Hexham, gave the English a sense of righteous purpose. This would not be merely a battle, but a punishment, a judgment delivered by English arms on Scottish sacrilege. As dawn broke on October 17, 1346, Ralph Neville led his army toward the Scottish camp at Beaufort. The English moved quickly but carefully, maintaining formation and keeping scouts ahead to watch for any Scottish pickets or patrols. The approach to Durham led through rolling countryside of fields and woodland, across streams and along ancient tracks, and Neville chose his route to bring his army to the high ground west of Durham, where an ancient Anglo-Saxon cross stood marking boundaries that had been sacred since time immemorial. This cross would give its name to the battle and to the Neville family itself, for Ralph would later pay for a new cross to be erected on the spot to commemorate the victory. The cross stood on a ridge that commanded a view of the surrounding country, providing an excellent defensive position. If the Scots wanted to fight, they would have to attack uphill against an English position that Neville would carefully arrange to maximize the advantage of his longbowmen. The Scottish army became aware of the English approach sometime in the early morning of October 17. Pickets and scouts rushed back to the camp at Beaufort with news that a substantial English force was marching toward them, and King David II had to make quick decisions. The Scots were not fully prepared for immediate battle. They had been expecting to wait for their ransom payment, and some soldiers had dispersed to forage or had removed their armor for comfort. Now they had to arm themselves hastily and form into battle array. David ordered his army to abandon the camp at Beaufort and to move to occupy the high ground west of Durham, where the ancient cross stood. This was sound military thinking. Taking the high ground would give the Scots a defensive advantage and force the English to attack uphill. The Scottish army moved quickly, forming into 3 divisions, as was customary in medieval warfare. Each division consisted of a mix of armoured cavalry, men-at-arms fighting on foot, pikemen and archers, arranged in formations that could either receive an attack or advance against the enemy. King David personally took command of the centre division, the position of honour for a medieval king, who was expected to lead his army from the front. Surrounding David were his most loyal nobles and his household knights, men sworn to defend their king to the death. David had proven his courage in previous campaigns, and despite his youth, he was only 22. He had the confidence and bearing of a warrior king. He understood that this battle would define his reign. Victory would secure his position in Scotland and vindicate his decision to honour the old alliance, while defeat could be catastrophic. On the right wing of the Scottish army, David placed John Randolph, Earl of Moray, who commanded the 1st Division. Moray was an experienced noble who had recently returned from France and who brought with him not only French military advisors, but also a sophisticated understanding of continental warfare. Moray's division included some of the best equipped Scottish soldiers, and David trusted him to anchor the Scottish right. The left wing was commanded by Patrick Dunbar, Earl of March, leading the 3rd Division. Dunbar was head of one of Scotland's most ancient noble families, the Earls of Dunbar, who had held their title since the 12th century. However, there was already some tension in the Scottish command structure. According to some chronicles, Dunbar had been offered command of the 1st Division, but had refused it, possibly because he resented not being given command of the centre. This refusal might have indicated divided loyalties or personal rivalries that would prove significant once the battle began. The Scottish position appeared strong. They held high ground with their flanks protected by broken terrain, ravines, dense scrub, and marshy ground that would make it difficult for the English to execute a flanking attack. They had a larger army than the English, estimated at around 10 to 12,000 men, compared to the English 6 to 7,000. They were well equipped, having had time to prepare for this campaign, and having looted additional supplies and weapons during their march through England. And they were led by their king, which gave them a unity of command and a morale boost that could be crucial in the close quarters brutality of medieval combat. But the Scots also had weaknesses that Ralph Neville understood and intended to exploit. The Scottish position, while providing some defensive advantages, was not ideal for the kind of mobile warfare at which Scottish armies traditionally excelled. The terrain that protected their flanks also limited their own freedom of movement, making it difficult for them to maneuver or retreat if things went badly. More critically, the Scots did not have an answer to the English longbow, that devastating weapon that had just destroyed the French army at Crécy. Medieval longbows, as used by the English and Welsh archers, were weapons of formidable power. Made from carefully selected yew wood, typically imported from Italy or Spain, where the best yew grew, these bows stood as tall as a man, 6 feet or more, and required enormous strength to draw. A skilled archer needed years of practice to develop the muscle and technique necessary to use such a weapon effectively. English law required all able-bodied men to practice archery regularly, and the best archers were essentially professional soldiers who had been shooting since childhood. The arrows shot from these longbows were equally specialized. Long shafts tipped with steel bodkin points designed to penetrate armor. or barbed broadheads designed to cause terrible wounds in unarmoured targets. An arrow from a longbow could penetrate chainmail at close range, and even plate armour could be pierced if the angle was right. The psychological impact was perhaps as important as the physical damage. The whistling sound of hundreds or thousands of arrows in flight, the sight of men falling all around, the knowledge that death could come at any moment from a missile you couldn't see until it was too late, all combined to create terror that could break even experienced soldiers' morale. The English army, as it approached the Scottish position, was arranged in 3 divisions matching the Scottish deployment. Ralph Neville ensured that his longbowmen were positioned on the flanks of each division, where they would have clear fields of fire and could shoot into the Scottish formations from angles that would maximise casualties. Sir Henry Percy commanded the English right wing. Sir Thomas Rokeby led the left wing, and Archbishop de la Zouche took charge of the centre division, riding along the English lines offering blessings and encouragement. The Archbishop's participation in the battle gave it a crusading atmosphere. He blessed the soldiers, promising them that their cause was just, and that those who fell fighting against the Scottish invaders would receive divine mercy. With de la Zouche rode a Minoret friar, a member of the Franciscan order known for their poverty and dedication, who wielded a cudgel rather than a sword. Clerics were forbidden to shed blood, though apparently crushing heads with a club was acceptable. This friar exhorted the English soldiers with fierce rhetoric, telling them to show no mercy to the Scots, promising them absolution for any acts committed in defence of England, and generally working the troops into a righteous fury. The English advance up the slope toward the Scottish position began in the late morning or early afternoon. The exact timing is not recorded with precision by the chroniclers, who were more interested in dramatic details than exact schedules. The English moved in good order, maintaining their formations, with the men-at-arms and knights in the centre of each division and the archers on the wings. As they came within range of the Scottish position, Ralph Neville gave the order, and the archers began to shoot. The effect was devastating. Thousands of arrows arced through the air and fell among the Scottish ranks, like deadly hail. Men fell screaming as arrows pierced through armour, found gaps in protection, or struck unarmoured faces, necks, and limbs. The Scottish army had no effective counter to this barrage. Scottish archers were less numerous and less skilled than their English counterparts, and they could not match the range or rate of fire of the English longbows. The Scottish right wing, under the Earl of Moray, took the worst of the initial arrow storm. Moray's division, exposed to fire from the English left and centre, began to waver as casualties mounted. Medieval soldiers, no matter how brave or well-trained, had limits to what they could endure. Standing still under arrow fire, watching comrades fall, knowing that the next arrow might strike you, created unbearable psychological pressure. Moray's division began to lose cohesion as men sought cover or tried to close with the English to escape the arrows. According to English chroniclers, who admittedly were writing to celebrate their victory and thus had every reason to exaggerate Scottish failures and downplay English difficulties, the Earl of Moray's division broke and fled the field relatively early in the battle. The chroniclers describe with evident satisfaction how Moray's men turned their backs and fought with great success by running away, managing to enter Scotland without a single wound, while leaving King David to dance as he felt inclined. This contemptuous description reflects the English view that the Scottish right wing simply abandoned their king at the first serious test. The truth was probably more complex. Moray's division may have attempted to advance against the English position, but been stopped by the arrow fire before they could close. Or they may have been caught by an English counterattack and driven from the field. Whatever the exact sequence of events, it is clear that the Scottish right wing collapsed, and Moray's soldiers fled from the battlefield, streaming north toward the safety of Scotland and abandoning their king and their comrades to face the English alone. The Scottish left wing under the Earl of March suffered a similar fate. Some chronicles suggest that Dunbar, who had been offended by not receiving command of the 1st Division, took the opportunity to retreat from the battle with his honour technically intact. He hadn't fled like a coward. He had withdrawn his division in good order when the battle was clearly lost. Other accounts are less charitable, suggesting that Dunbar's division simply broke under the English assault, just as Moray's had done. Whatever Dunbar's motivations, the result was that the Scottish left wing also quit the field, leaving King David's centre division to fight alone against the entire English army. But King David II refused to flee. The young Scottish king, seeing both his wings collapse and knowing that his army was disintegrating around him, nevertheless ordered his centre division forward. This was courage of the highest order. David knew that the battle was lost, knew that retreat was the sensible option, but his honour as a king and as the son of Robert the Bruce demanded that he fight. If he fled now, his reputation would be ruined, his authority in Scotland would be undermined, and his enemies would claim that he was unworthy of his father's legacy. Better to die fighting than to live as a king who had run from battle. David's centre division advanced down the slope toward the English lines, attempting to close with the enemy before the archers could annihilate them entirely. This was the moment of greatest danger for the English. If the Scottish centre could break through the English lines before losing too many men to arrow fire, the battle could still turn in Scotland's favour. Medieval close quarters combat favoured the side with numbers and momentum, and if the Scots could transform this into a melee, they might overcome the English. But Ralph Neville had positioned his forces well, and the English held firm. The archers continued to shoot into the Scottish ranks, thinning them as they advanced. When the Scots finally closed with the English lines, the fighting became brutal hand-to-hand combat. Swords against spears, axes against shields, men grappling and stabbing at close quarters, where armour and skill mattered more than weapons. The English men-at-arms, many of them experienced soldiers who had fought in France, held their positions and traded blows with the Scottish warriors. King David fought personally in the thick of the melee. Medieval kings were expected to lead from the front, to inspire their men through personal example, and to demonstrate the martial prowess that justified their royal status. David wielded his weapons with skill and courage, cutting down English soldiers and encouraging his men to press the attack. But courage could not overcome the tactical situation. With both his wings gone, David's division was surrounded on three sides, taking attacks from the English right, centre and left. The archers continued to pour arrows into the Scottish ranks from the flanks, and the pressure on the Scots became unbearable. Contemporary accounts mention that David received serious wounds during the fighting. Some sources specifically state that he was struck by arrows, possibly in the face, though the exact nature of his injuries is not described in detail by the chroniclers. What is clear is that David continued to fight even after being wounded, refusing to yield or flee as long as his men were still fighting. This determination impressed even his enemies. English chroniclers, while celebrating the victory, acknowledge that the Scottish king fought bravely, but the Scottish centre division was doomed. Surrounded, outnumbered, taking casualties from arrows and from close combat, the Scottish formation began to collapse. The orderly ranks broke apart as men fled individually or in small groups, each seeking to save himself when it became clear that collective resistance was futile. The English pressed their advantage ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing Scots and taking prisoners when ransoms could be expected. As his division disintegrated, King David finally attempted to flee. He and a handful of loyal followers made for the River Brownie, which ran through a valley not far from the battlefield. There was a bridge across the river, and if David could reach it and cross, he might escape the pursuing English and make his way towards Scotland. But the English pursuit was relentless, and Scottish soldiers fleeing toward the same bridge created confusion and crowding. According to the account that has come down to us, which was probably embellished in the retelling, English soldiers pursuing the fleeing Scots across the bridge noticed a wounded man in rich armour attempting to cross. One version of the story says that they saw his reflection in the water below the bridge and recognized from his equipment that this must be someone important. The soldiers seized him, and to their astonishment, they had captured David II, King of Scotland. The man credited with actually taking the king prisoner was John de Coupland, an English knight from Northumberland. Coupland would later be richly rewarded for his service. King Edward III granted him lands, money, and honours in recognition of this extraordinary feat. Capturing an enemy king in battle was one of the greatest accomplishments a medieval knight could achieve, bringing immortal glory and substantial material rewards. Coupland became a minor celebrity, his name recorded in chronicles and his deeds celebrated in popular songs and stories. For King David II, capture meant humiliation, but also, paradoxically, preservation. A captured king was far too valuable to kill. He represented an enormous potential ransom, a diplomatic bargaining chip, and a trophy that demonstrated English superiority over Scotland. David would be treated with the courtesy owed to a king, even a defeated and captive one, and he would eventually be returned to Scotland, though at a tremendous price. In the immediate aftermath of his capture, David was taken to Ralph Neville, who received the Scottish king with the formal courtesy that medieval chivalry demanded. Whatever Neville's personal feelings about the Scots, David was a king and an anointed monarch, entitled to respect even in defeat. The battle itself continued for some time after David's capture, as pockets of Scottish resistance fought on, and the English pursued fleeing Scots across the countryside. Medieval battles rarely ended with a clean conclusion. Instead, they typically devolved into a running pursuit where the victors chased and killed the defeated until darkness ended the slaughter or the pursuers became too exhausted to continue. The Battle of Neville's Cross followed this pattern, with English soldiers hunting down Scottish stragglers through the afternoon and into the evening. The Scottish casualties were appalling. Contemporary estimates, which should be treated with some caution given medieval chroniclers' tendency to exaggerate, suggest that more than 1,000 Scottish soldiers were killed in the battle and the subsequent pursuit. Modern historians generally consider these numbers plausible given the size of the armies involved and the one-sided nature of the combat once the Scottish flanks collapsed. More significantly for Scotland's future, the battle resulted in the death or capture of much of Scotland's military and political leadership. Among the Scottish nobles killed were some of the most important magnates in the kingdom. David de la Haye, who held the crucial position of Constable of Scotland and was responsible for the king's military household, fell in the fighting. Robert Keith, the Marischal of Scotland, the Scottish equivalent of the English Earl Marshal, was also killed, as was John de Roxburgh, the Chamberlain. The Chancellor, Lord Thomas Charteris, died on the field. Two powerful earls were among the dead: John Randolph, Earl of Moray, whose division had collapsed early in the battle, but who had apparently rallied some men and returned to the fighting before being killed, and Maurice de Moravia, Earl of Strathearn. Also killed was Niall Bruce of Carrick, an illegitimate son of Robert the Bruce, and thus King David's half-brother. The deaths of these men meant that Scotland lost not just military commanders, but also experienced administrators and councillors whose advice and leadership would be sorely missed in the years ahead. The list of captured Scottish nobles was equally impressive and would have even more lasting consequences. William Douglas, known as the Knight of Liddesdale, was captured. Douglas was Scotland's most skilled guerrilla fighter, a commander whose raids into England had been a constant thorn in the English side. 4 Scottish earls were also captured, though the chroniclers don't agree on which specific earls these were. All of these nobles would spend years in English captivity awaiting ransom, removing them from Scottish politics and warfare during a crucial period. The financial impact on Scottish noble families would be severe. Raising ransom payments would require selling lands, borrowing money, and imposing heavy taxation on their tenants, weakening these families for years or even generations. Some captives would never be ransomed, dying in English prisons far from home. The families that did manage to raise ransoms would be impoverished by the effort, losing the wealth that sustained their political power and military capacity. The English casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light. English chronicles mention only a few dozen men killed, though this seems implausibly low and probably reflects incomplete records rather than actual casualties. Even if we assume that English losses were significantly higher than the chronicles admit, the disparity in casualties was clearly enormous. This was typical of medieval battles, where one side achieved tactical surprise or held a significant advantage. Once one army began to break, casualties became very one-sided as the victors slaughtered fleeing enemies who could no longer effectively defend themselves. For Ralph Neville, personally, the victory was the crowning achievement of his life. He had commanded an English army to victory over a Scottish invasion, had captured the King of Scotland, and had secured the north against further Scottish aggression for years to come. The treasure in ransoms alone would make him wealthy. Captured nobles would pay enormous sums for their freedom, and as commander of the victorious army, Neville would receive a substantial share. But more important than money was the glory and reputation that came from such a victory. Medieval society valued military success above almost all other achievements. A lord who proved himself in battle earned the respect of his peers, the loyalty of his followers, and the favour of his king. Ralph Neville had now joined the ranks of the great English military commanders, men whose names would be remembered in chronicles and celebrated in songs. The victory would be associated with his family name forever, commemorated in the name of the battle itself, the Battle of Neville's Cross. In the days and weeks following the Battle of Neville's Cross, the full magnitude of the English victory became apparent, and Ralph Neville took steps to ensure that this triumph would be remembered for generations. The immediate aftermath of the battle was consumed with practical matters, securing prisoners, collecting the wounded, gathering weapons and armor from the dead, and organizing the enormous administrative task of processing ransoms for the captured Scottish nobles. But Neville understood that military victory needed to be transformed into lasting glory through proper commemoration and symbolic gestures. Ralph Neville's first act of commemoration was deeply religious in character, reflecting the medieval understanding that military success was a gift from God that required appropriate thanksgiving. Neville paid for the erection of a new cross on the battlefield ridge, where the fighting had been most intense, on the spot where the ancient Anglo-Saxon boundary cross had stood. This new cross was not a simple wooden marker, but an elaborate stone monument, carved with religious imagery and inscriptions that would proclaim the English victory to all who passed by. The cross that Neville erected would stand for nearly 2.5 centuries, becoming a landmark that gave its name not just to the battle, but to the entire area. Pilgrims travelling to Durham would pass the cross and offer prayers of thanksgiving for the English victory. Local people would use it as a meeting place and a boundary marker. the site would become associated with stories of the battle, with old soldiers recounting their experiences to younger generations, ensuring that the memory of October 17, 1346 remained vivid in the collective consciousness of the region. The cross survived until 1589, during the reign of Elizabeth I, when it was destroyed as part of the religious upheavals of the Protestant Reformation. Reformers who regarded such monuments as idolatrous or superstitious pulled it down, scattering the stones and obliterating the inscriptions that Ralph Neville had commissioned. But the name Neville's Cross survived the destruction of the monument itself, and today a suburb of modern Durham still bears this name, preserving the memory of the battle more than 6.5 centuries after it was fought. The most valuable prize from the battle was, of course, King David II himself. The captured Scottish king represented an extraordinary diplomatic and financial opportunity for England, but his custody and treatment required careful consideration. David could not simply be thrown into a dungeon like an ordinary prisoner. He was an anointed king, a fellow monarch, and his treatment would be observed by courts across Europe. Any excessive cruelty or humiliation of David would reflect badly on England and on King Edward III personally, potentially alienating other European rulers and undermining England's diplomatic position. At the same time, David could not be treated too generously, as if his capture were merely an unfortunate incident rather than a crushing defeat. The English needed to demonstrate that Scottish aggression had been punished, that the old alliance with France had failed to protect Scotland, and that England was the dominant power in Britain. The balance between courtesy to a fellow king and the demonstration of English superiority required delicate management. King David was initially held by Ralph Neville at one of the Neville castles, probably Raby itself, where he was treated with the respect owed to his rank, but was kept under secure guard to prevent any attempt at escape or rescue. Messengers were sent south to inform King Edward III, who was still besieging Calais in France, of the extraordinary victory and the capture of the Scottish king. Edward's response, when it came, reflected his pleasure at this unexpected triumph. While he had been winning glory in France at Crecy, his subjects at home had matched his achievement by defeating the Scots and capturing their king. Edward ordered that David be brought south to London, where he could be displayed to the English people, and where the diplomatic negotiations for his ransom could be conducted at the highest level. The journey from Durham to London became a kind of triumphal procession, with David escorted through English cities and towns where crowds gathered to see the captive Scottish king. This public display served multiple purposes. It demonstrated English power. It satisfied popular curiosity about the defeated enemy, and it reminded everyone who saw David that rebellion against England carried severe consequences. In London, David was housed in the Tower of London, the great fortress on the Thames that served simultaneously as a royal palace, a secure prison, and a symbol of royal authority. David's quarters in the Tower were comfortable by medieval standards. He was not held in a dungeon, but in proper chambers, with servants to attend him, good food, and the freedom to receive visitors and conduct correspondence under supervision. But he was nonetheless a prisoner, held at the pleasure of the English king, and unable to return to Scotland except on terms that England dictated. The negotiations for David's ransom would drag on for 11 long years, becoming one of the major diplomatic issues of the mid-14th century. The Scottish kingdom, already impoverished by decades of warfare, struggled to raise the enormous sum that England demanded for David's release. The English initially asked for a ransom of 100,000 marks, approximately £66,700 in the currency of the time, and roughly equivalent to £78 million in modern money, when adjusted for inflation and changes in the value of money. This was an astronomical sum that Scotland simply could not pay quickly. The ransom negotiations became entangled with broader diplomatic issues between England and Scotland. Edward III wanted not just money, but political concessions, recognition of English overlordship, territorial cessions, agreements that Scotland would not support France against England. David, even as a prisoner, tried to protect Scottish interests and refused to accept terms that would permanently compromise Scotland's independence. Scottish nobles and clergy sent embassies to London to negotiate, but progress was painfully slow. Finally, in 1357, after 11 years of captivity during which David had seen his youth pass while confined in English castles, a treaty was concluded. The Treaty of Berwick established that David would be released upon payment of a ransom of 100,000 marks, to be paid in instalments over 10 years. Each year, on June 24th, the feast of St. John the Baptist, Scotland would pay 10,000 marks to England. During this period, a truce would be in effect, with Scottish citizens prohibited from bearing arms against Edward III or any of his subjects, and with the English supposed to refrain from attacking Scotland. This treaty marked David's release and his return to Scotland, but it also marked the effective end of the Second War of Scottish Independence and the beginning of a long period of Anglo-Scottish peace that would last for 4 decades. The Battle of Neville's Cross had demonstrated so decisively that Scotland could not defeat England militarily, that both sides accepted the necessity of peace. Scotland focused on internal recovery and development, while England continued its wars in France. The border, while never entirely peaceful, became significantly less violent than it had been in previous decades. For Ralph Neville, the capture of King David brought enormous material rewards, while the king himself was ultimately ransomed by the Scottish kingdom rather than by a private individual. Neville received substantial payments from Edward III as a reward for his service in commanding the victorious army. He also received shares of the ransoms paid by captured Scottish nobles, and these payments enriched the Neville family substantially. The wealth generated by the battle would help fund the construction and expansion of Raby Castle in subsequent decades, transforming it from a relatively modest fortification into one of the great castles of northern England. Beyond the material rewards, Neville's reputation was immensely enhanced. He became known throughout England as the victor of Neville's Cross, the commander who had captured a Scottish king, the defender of the North. When King Edward III returned from France, having captured Calais and established English control of that crucial port, he found that his subjects at home had matched his achievements abroad. Edward was generous in his praise and rewards for the northern lords who had won the battle, and Ralph Neville received particular recognition. The king's favour was demonstrated through grants of additional lands, appointments to positions of authority, and most importantly, through the simple fact that Edward trusted Neville to continue serving as warden of the marches and defender of the north. This trust was not merely a matter of personal regard, but a practical recognition that Neville had proven his competence in the most decisive way possible. Medieval kings needed reliable men in crucial positions, and Neville had demonstrated beyond any doubt that he was such a man. The Battle of Neville's Cross also had important consequences for the balance of power among the northern English nobility. The Percy family, though they had participated in the battle and shared in the glory, had not commanded the army. Ralph Neville had held overall command, and it was Neville's name that would be forever associated with the victory. This established a precedent and a reputation that would benefit the Neville family in their ongoing competition with the Percys for preeminence in the north. The two families, Neville and Percy, were natural rivals simply because of their similar positions. Both held vast estates in the north. Both served as wardens of the marches. Both had ancient pedigrees and proud traditions. In a hierarchical society, where status and precedence mattered enormously, any situation where both families were present required careful negotiation to determine who would take priority. Would a Neville Earl sit above or below a Percy Earl at a feast? Who would speak first in a council meeting? Who would command when both families provided troops for the same campaign? These questions, which might seem trivial to modern readers, were deadly serious in medieval England. Insults to honour and status could lead to feuds that lasted for generations and could escalate into private warfare. The Neville victory at Neville's Cross gave the family an argument for precedence that the Percys found difficult to counter. Whatever the Percys' achievements in other battles and campaigns, they had not commanded the army that captured a Scottish king. This advantage would rankle with the Percys and would contribute to the increasingly bitter rivalry between the families that would explode into violence in the 15th century. Ralph Neville did not rest on his laurels after the Battle of Neville's Cross. He continued to serve as warden of the marches, defending the border against Scottish raids, negotiating truces and prisoners' exchanges, administering justice in the border regions, and maintaining the military readiness that England's northern defences required. He also worked to consolidate and expand his family's estates, making advantageous land purchases, arranging marriages for his children, and building the network of alliances and clients that enhanced noble power in medieval society. The Cathedral Church of Durham, which had been saved from Scottish devastation by the English victory, commemorated the battle in its own ways. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered at St. Cuthbert's shrine for the deliverance of the city, and the monks who had offered to pay the Scots £1,000 to spare the cathedral now spent their money instead on embellishing the church and endowing masses for the souls of those who had died defending England. The battle became part of Durham's local history and identity, a moment of danger survived and enemies defeated through a combination of English valour and divine intervention. Ralph Neville commissioned his own commemoration of the victory beyond the battlefield cross. When he eventually died and was buried at Staindrop Church near Raby Castle, his tomb and monument would recall his greatest achievement. Medieval tombs were not merely grave markers, but elaborate statements about the deceased's life, status, and accomplishments, and the Nevilles would ensure that visitors to Staindrop Church would learn of Ralph's victory over the Scots. The victory also established a template for how the Neville family would build and maintain its power in the generations to come. Military service to the crown, competent administration of the border defences, careful accumulation of wealth and lands, strategic marriages, and the cultivation of royal favour. These would remain the pillars of Neville power. Ralph had shown his descendants how it was done, and they would follow his example, building on his achievements to raise the family to heights that Ralph himself could scarcely have imagined. The Battle of Neville's Cross demonstrated that northern families like the Nevilles were not merely regional powers, but could play decisive roles in national affairs. The battle that Ralph Neville won in October 1346 prevented a Scottish devastation of northern England, secured King Edward III's rear while he campaigned in France, captured a Scottish king, and established a long peace on the border that would benefit both kingdoms. It was one of the most important English victories of the 14th century, and it belonged to the Nevilles. The decades following the Battle of Neville's Cross saw the Neville family continue their steady accumulation of power and influence, but the true transformation that would elevate them into the very highest ranks of English nobility would come in the late 14th century through a combination of political acumen, military service, strategic opportunism, and a marriage that would change the family's destiny forever. To understand how this transformation occurred, we must first understand the turbulent and dangerous political landscape of late 14th century England, where kings struggled with overmighty subjects, where powerful nobles competed for influence and resources, and where a single mistake could mean the difference between greatness and destruction. The England of the late 1300s was a realm transformed by war, plague, and social change. The Black Death had arrived in 1348, just 2 years after the Battle of Neville's Cross, and had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population in a series of devastating outbreaks that continued for decades. This demographic catastrophe had profound consequences. Labor became scarce and expensive. Traditional social hierarchies were disrupted. Agricultural production declined, and the entire economy was restructured. For noble families like the Nevilles, the plague meant that their estates were worth less because there were fewer tenants to pay rent, fewer workers to cultivate the land, and fewer people to provide the feudal services upon which noble power depended. At the same time, England's war in France continued to consume enormous resources while providing increasingly uncertain returns. The great English victories of the mid-14th century, Crécy, Poitiers, Niagara, had been followed by decades of inconclusive campaigning, lost territory, and mounting costs. The financial burden of the war fell heavily on the English population through taxation, and resentment of these taxes contributed to social unrest, including the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381, that briefly threatened to overthrow the entire social order. Into this turbulent world came Ralph Neville, born around 1364, who would become the first Earl of Westmorland and the father of a dynasty that would shake England to its foundations. This Ralph was the great-great-grandson of the Ralph Neville, who had won glory at Neville's Cross, and he inherited both the family's estates and their reputation for military prowess and administrative competence. His father was John Neville, who had held the title of 3rd Baron Neville de Raby, and his mother was Maud Percy, a daughter of Henry de Percy, 2nd Baron Percy. Ralph's mother's connection to the Percy family is worth examining, as it reveals both the complex web of kinship that united England's noble families and the tensions that could exist even between families bound by marriage. The marriage between John Neville and Maud Percy had been intended to create or strengthen an alliance between the two greatest families of the North, ensuring cooperation in the defense of the border and the administration of the region. Marriages between rival families were a common strategy in medieval politics, based on the theory that blood ties would moderate conflicts and encourage cooperation. But the strategy did not always work as intended. Despite the marriage connection, the Neville and Percy families remained fundamentally competitors for the same resources: royal offices, lands, influence over lesser northern families, and the prestige of being recognized as the preeminent power in the north. These competitive interests would eventually override kinship bonds, and in later generations the Percy-Neville rivalry would erupt into violence that would claim lives on both sides and destabilize the entire region. Young Ralph Neville grew up in this atmosphere of power, prestige, and underlying tension. He was raised at Raby Castle, that great fortress that symbolized Neville power, and he received the education appropriate to a future baron. This education combined military training, how to fight with sword, lance, and other weapons, how to ride a war horse in full armor, how to command men in battle, with more subtle skills like literacy, languages. Latin and French were essential for a nobleman who needed to read legal documents and conduct diplomatic correspondence, estate management, and political acumen. Medieval noble education was not conducted in schools, but through practical experience and mentorship. Ralph would have learned to fight by practicing with other boys and young men in the castle yard, under the instruction of experienced knights and men-at-arms, who could teach proper technique. He would have learned estate management by accompanying his father and the family stewards as they inspected lands, collected rents, settled disputes among tenants, and made decisions about agricultural production. He would have learned politics by observing and participating in the endless negotiations, alliances, and conflicts that characterized relations among the northern nobility. When Ralph's father John died in October 1388, young Ralph inherited the title of 4th Baron Neville de Raby at the age of 24. This was a crucial age for a medieval nobleman, old enough to have gained some experience and maturity, but young enough to have energy and ambition for advancement. Ralph took possession of the vast Neville estates centred on Raby Castle and Brancepeth, became responsible for maintaining the family's military forces and fulfilling their feudal obligations to the crown, and stepped into the role of head of the family with all the responsibilities and opportunities that entailed. The political landscape that Ralph Neville entered as Baron was treacherous and violent, dominated by the increasingly erratic rule of King Richard II and the growing opposition of powerful nobles who resented the king's policies. Richard II, who had been crowned in 1377 at the age of 10, following the death of his grandfather Edward III, had spent his youth under the control of powerful nobles who governed in his name while he was too young to rule effectively. When Richard finally gained personal control of the government in his late teens, he was determined to assert royal authority and to punish those who had humiliated him during his minority. The conflict between Richard II and his leading nobles came to a head in the mid-1380s, with the crisis known as the Lords Appellant. A group of 5 powerful nobles, the Dukes of Gloucester and Lancaster's son, Henry Bolingbroke among them, appealed or accused several of Richard's closest advisors of treason, effectively staging a coup that stripped Richard of real power and left him as a figurehead while they governed in his name. The Lords Appellant put Richard's favourites on trial, executing some and sending others into exile, and they dominated English government for several years. Ralph Neville's brother Alexander had the misfortune to be one of Richard II's close advisors during this crisis. Alexander Neville had risen to become Archbishop of York in the early 1370s, one of the highest positions in the English Church, and a post of enormous wealth and influence. As Archbishop, Alexander wielded both spiritual authority and temporal power. He commanded the revenues of the vast archbishopric, administered his own courts of law, and played a major role in northern politics and administration. Alexander had also become a close counsellor to King Richard II, and he supported Richard's attempts to assert royal authority against the rebellious nobles. When the Lords Appellant seized power in 1386, Alexander was prosecuted along with Richard's other leading adherents. The Archbishop's clerical status saved his life. Medieval canon law protected clergy from execution by secular authorities, but he suffered the confiscation of his property and was effectively driven into exile. Alexander fled to the continent, where he would die in obscurity, his career ruined by backing the wrong side in England's factional conflicts. Alexander's fate provided Ralph Neville with a stark lesson in the dangers of medieval politics. Despite his brother's high position and the theoretical protection afforded by his clerical status, Alexander had been destroyed when his patron the king lost power. Ralph understood that survival and advancement required careful judgment about which side to support in political conflicts, along with the flexibility to change sides when circumstances required. Rigid loyalty was a virtue that chroniclers praised in retrospect, but living nobles needed to be more pragmatic if they wanted to keep their heads attached to their shoulders. Despite his brother's disgrace, Ralph Neville chose to support King Richard II when the king moved against the Lords Appellant in 1397, seeking revenge for the humiliations they had inflicted upon him. Richard, after years of outward submission and inward resentment, finally felt strong enough to strike back at his enemies. He arrested some of the Lords Appellant, forced others into exile, and executed the Duke of Gloucester. It was a dramatic demonstration of royal power, and those nobles who supported Richard in this moment were richly rewarded. On September 29, 1397, as a reward for his loyalty during this crisis, Ralph Neville was created Earl of Westmorland by King Richard II. This was an extraordinary elevation. Ralph jumped from being a baron, one rank in the nobility, to being an earl, the highest rank of nobility below the royal family itself. The title brought not only prestige, but also substantial practical benefits. Earls sat in the inner circles of royal government, wielded enormous influence over policy and patronage, and enjoyed precedence over lesser nobles in the complex hierarchy of medieval society. The creation of the Earldom of Westmorland was particularly significant because it established a new title rather than inheriting an old one. Many earldoms were ancient, dating back centuries and carrying with them traditions and expectations that could limit their holders' freedom of action. But Westmorland was a new creation, Ralph Neville's personal achievement, and it carried no historical baggage. The title referred to Westmorland County in the northwest of England, part of the territory where the Neville family held lands and exercised influence. But the earldom's authority extended far beyond any single county. Ralph's elevation to the earldom brought him into the very highest ranks of the English nobility, but it also tied him closely to King Richard II at a moment when the king was making dangerous enemies. Richard's revenge on the Lords Appellant and his increasingly arbitrary exercise of power alienated many nobles who might otherwise have supported him. Richard's seizure of the Lancastrian estates after John of Gaunt's death in 1399, and his extension of the banishment of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, proved to be fatal mistakes that would bring down the king and transform English politics. But before Richard's downfall, Ralph Neville experienced a personal loss that would ultimately prove to be a transformative opportunity. His first wife, Margaret Stafford, daughter of Hugh Stafford, Earl of Stafford, died on June 9, 1396. Margaret had been a suitable match for a baron of good family, bringing with her a modest dowry and connections to the Stafford family, one of the important noble houses of the Midlands. She had given Ralph 12 children over the years of their marriage, providing heirs to continue the Neville line and daughters who could be married to create alliances with other families. Medieval noblewomen frequently died in childbirth or from complications related to the numerous pregnancies that were expected of them, and Margaret's death, while tragic, was not unusual. Ralph now found himself a widower at about 32 years of age, with 12 children ranging from infants to young adults who needed to be provided for and educated. As Earl of Westmorland, Ralph was an extremely eligible bachelor. His title, wealth, and influence made him a desirable husband for any family with a marriageable daughter. Ralph chose to remarry before November 29, 1396, less than 6 months after Margaret's death. This quick remarriage was not considered inappropriate in medieval society, where practical considerations often outweighed sentiment. A nobleman needed a wife to manage his household, to provide heirs. Ralph had sons from his first marriage, but infant mortality was high, and additional heirs were valuable insurance. And to cement political alliances, Ralph's second marriage would prove to be the single most consequential decision of his life, one that would transform the Neville family from important regional nobles into a family with royal connections and dynastic ambitions. Ralph Neville's second wife was Joan Beaufort, and this union would change everything. To understand the significance of Ralph Neville's marriage to Joan Beaufort, we must first understand who Joan was, where she came from, and what connections she brought to the marriage. Joan's story is intimately connected with one of the most powerful and complex figures in late medieval English history, her father, John of Gaunt, 1st Duke of Lancaster, a man who was virtually a king in all but name, and whose children and grandchildren would shape England's destiny for the next century. John of Gaunt was born in 1340 in Ghent, the French name for which is Gaunt, hence his name, the third surviving son of King Edward III of England and Queen Philippa of Hainault. As a son of the king, John was a prince of the blood royal from birth, but as a third son, he was unlikely ever to become king himself. His older brothers Edward the Black Prince and Lionel of Antwerp stood ahead of him in the succession, and they would presumably have sons who would inherit before John had any chance at the throne. But John of Gaunt would become one of the most powerful men in England through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and political skill. His first wife was Blanche of Lancaster, who brought him the vast Duchy of Lancaster when her father and sister died, making John one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. When his brother, the Black Prince, died in 1376, and his father, Edward III, died in 1377, John became the most powerful figure in England as the adult uncle of the new boy king Richard II. For years, John effectively governed England while Richard was too young to rule, making the crucial decisions about war, taxation, and policy that shaped the kingdom. John of Gaunt's legitimate children, from his marriages to Blanche of Lancaster and later to Constance of Castile, would be important nobles in their own right. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, would eventually become King Henry IV of England, founding the Lancastrian dynasty. But Joan Beaufort was not born from either of John's marriages. She was born from his long-term relationship with Catherine Swynford, and this fact would complicate her status and that of her siblings in ways that would echo through English history for generations. Catherine Swynford had entered John of Gaunt's life as the governess of his children by his first wife Blanche of Lancaster. Catherine was herself from a family of Flemish knights in the service of Queen Philippa, and she had been married to a knight named Hugh Swynford, by whom she had children. When Hugh died, Catherine continued in service to John of Gaunt's household, and at some point, the exact timing is unclear, she and John began a romantic relationship that would last for decades. Medieval society had complex attitudes towards such relationships. On one hand, extramarital affairs were common among the nobility and were often tolerated as long as they were conducted with discretion and did not create public scandal. Kings and great lords frequently had mistresses, and children born from these relationships, while illegitimate, were often acknowledged and provided for by their fathers. On the other hand, the Church condemned all sexual relations outside of marriage as sinful, and illegitimate children suffered legal disabilities that prevented them from inheriting titles and estates. John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford had 4 children together, 3 sons named John, Henry, and Thomas, and 1 daughter named Joan. These children took the surname Beaufort, after John's French lordship of Beaufort in Champagne, possibly because Joan Beaufort may have been born there, though evidence also suggests that Kettlethorpe in Lincolnshire, the Swynford family estate, might have been her birthplace. The usual date given for Joan's birth is 1379, making her about 17 when she married Ralph Neville, though some historians have suggested she might have been born earlier. The Beaufort children grew up in an ambiguous position. They were acknowledged by their father and received education and support appropriate to children of a great lord, but they were illegitimate, born outside of marriage, and this fact limited their prospects. In medieval England's legal and social system, illegitimate children could not inherit their father's title or estates, could not claim royal status, and faced restrictions on the positions they could hold and the marriages they could make. But John of Gaunt loved Catherine Swynford genuinely, and after the death of his second wife Constance of Castile in 1394, he decided to marry Catherine. Their wedding took place in 1396, nearly 25 years after their relationship had begun, and after their children were already adults. This marriage retrospectively legitimized the relationship and transformed Catherine from mistress to duchess, but it left the question of their children's status unresolved. John of Gaunt, wielding his enormous political influence, secured an extraordinary legal remedy for his children. In 1397, at his request, Parliament passed an act legitimizing all four Beaufort children, declaring that they were now legitimate children of John of Gaunt, despite having been born before their parents' marriage. This legitimation transformed Joan and her brothers from bastards into legitimate children of one of the most powerful men in England, making them suddenly eligible for positions of honour and advantageous marriages. There was, however, a crucial limitation. Joan's half-brother Henry Bolingbroke, John of Gaunt's legitimate son from his first marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, would later become King Henry IV when he deposed Richard II in 1399. As king, Henry added a clause to the Legitimation Act specifically barring the Beauforts and their descendants from ever inheriting the English throne. The Latin phrase used was excepta dignitate regali, except royal dignity. Whether Henry had the legal authority to modify an existing Act of Parliament unilaterally, without Parliament's formal consent, was debatable, and this ambiguity would haunt English politics for decades. For Joan Beaufort personally, the legitimation transformed her prospects. At age 18 or so, she was suddenly a legitimate daughter of John of Gaunt, making her a member of the royal family and an extremely desirable marriage partner for any ambitious nobleman. Her half-brother would soon be King of England. Her brothers were destined for high positions in church and state, and she carried the blood of King Edward III in her veins. Any children she had would be descendants of the royal line, connected by blood to the throne, even if barred from inheriting it. Ralph Neville recognized the extraordinary opportunity that marriage to Joan represented, though he was already Earl of Westmorland and a powerful figure in his own right. Marrying Joan would elevate his family to an entirely different level. His children by Joan would be grandchildren of John of Gaunt, great-grandchildren of King Edward III, and cousins to the future king. The Nevilles would no longer be merely important regional nobles, but would be a family with royal connections, entitled to sit at the high table of English politics, where the fate of the kingdom was decided. The marriage took place before November 29, 1396, at the Château de Beaufort in Maine-et-Loire, Anjou, France, Joan's namesake castle. The choice of location may have been partly practical. John of Gaunt had properties in France, and partly symbolic. The castle's name was tied to Joan's Beaufort identity. The marriage contract would have specified Joan's dowry, the property and money she brought to the marriage, and possibly the settlement that Ralph would make on her, ensuring her financial security if he died before her. Joan came to her marriage with Ralph not as a naive young bride, but as an experienced woman who had already been married once before. Her first husband had been Robert Ferrers, 2nd Baron Ferrers, whom she had married in 1391 or 1392, when she was about 12 or 13 years old. Such early marriages were not uncommon among the nobility, though they were typically not consummated until the bride was older. Robert Ferrers had died between May 1395 and November 1396, leaving Joan a widow with 2 young daughters. These daughters from Joan's first marriage, Elizabeth Ferrers and Mary Ferrers, became part of the extended Neville Beaufort family and would eventually be married advantageously. Mary would later marry Sir Ralph Neville, Ralph's son from his first marriage, and thus her stepbrother, creating one of those complex family relationships that were not uncommon in medieval noble families, where the pool of suitable marriage partners was limited. Joan Beaufort brought to her marriage with Ralph not just royal blood, but also considerable political skill and ambition. She had grown up in her father's household, observing high politics at the closest possible range, and she understood how power worked in medieval England. She knew that family advancement required careful attention to marriages, land acquisitions, royal favour, and the placement of family members in positions of influence. Joan would prove to be a formidable political operator in her own right, managing the family's interests with intelligence and determination. Ralph and Joan's marriage produced an extraordinary family, 14 children in all, a remarkably large number even by medieval standards, where multiple pregnancies were the norm. These children, born between about 1397 and the early 1410s, would be known as the Beaufort Nevilles, to distinguish them from Ralph's children by his first marriage, and they would be the instruments through which Joan would pursue her dynastic ambitions. Their children included Catherine Neville, who would marry multiple times into increasingly prestigious families; Eleanor Neville, who would marry Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, creating a marriage alliance with the Percy family; Richard Neville, who would become Earl of Salisbury and father to Warwick the Kingmaker; Robert Neville, who would become Bishop of Durham; William Neville, who would be created Earl of Kent; George Neville, who would become Baron Latimer; Edward Neville, who would become Baron Abergavenny; and most significantly for our story, Cecily Neville, who would marry Richard Duke of York and become mother to 2 kings. Each of these children would be carefully married or placed to advance the family's interests, creating a web of connections that would make the Nevilles one of the most powerful families in England. But this success for Joan's children would come at a terrible cost for Ralph's children from his first marriage, and the seeds of family disaster were being sown even as Ralph and Joan celebrated the births of their numerous offspring. Following her marriage, Cecily Neville settled into life as Duchess of York, dividing her time between her husband's various castles and manors across England. The young couple established their primary household at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, an impressive fortress that had belonged to the York family for generations. Here, Cecily would spend much of her married life, and here she would give birth to most of her children. Cecily proved remarkably fertile, bearing Richard at least 12 children over the course of their marriage, though as was tragically common in medieval times, several died in infancy or childhood. Her first child, a daughter named Joan, was born around 1438, but died young. Then came a series of children who survived to adulthood and who would play crucial roles in the dramatic events of the mid-15th century. On April 28, 1442, at Rouen in Normandy, where Richard was serving as the English military commander in occupied France, Cecily gave birth to a son named Edward. This child would grow up to be Edward IV, King of England, and would become one of the most successful warrior kings of the medieval period. Then came Edmund, Earl of Rutland, born in 1443, who would die tragically young fighting alongside his father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed, then Margaret, and then George, born in 1449, who would become Duke of Clarence, and whose treachery and execution would stain the family's history. On October 2nd, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle, Cecily gave birth to her final surviving son, Richard, who would become Duke of Gloucester and eventually King Richard III. The circumstances of Richard's birth would later become the subject of malicious rumours spread by his enemies. Some claimed he had been born prematurely, others that his birth had been difficult and that he emerged deformed. These stories were propaganda designed to portray Richard as unnatural and unworthy of kingship, but no contemporary evidence supports them. Richard was born a healthy child, who would grow into a capable soldier and administrator. As Duchess of York, Cecily managed vast estates, supervised the education of her children, maintained the dignity appropriate to her exalted station, and supported her husband through the increasingly dangerous political intrigues of the 1440s and 1450s. These were years of mounting crisis for England. King Henry VI proved to be a weak and ineffective ruler who suffered from bouts of mental illness. The government was dominated by corrupt favourites. England's possessions in France were lost in a series of humiliating defeats, and noble factions competed violently for control of the kingdom. Richard, Duke of York, Cecily's husband, had one of the strongest claims to the English throne through his descent from both Edward III as second and fourth sons. As the Lancastrian government under Henry VI deteriorated, Richard began to position himself as a reformer who could restore good governance. But his efforts to reform the government brought him into direct conflict with Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's formidable French wife, who viewed Richard as a threat to her husband's throne and to the inheritance of her son, Prince Edward. The conflict between York and Lancaster escalated through the 1450s, erupting into open warfare in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans, where Richard's forces defeated the Lancastrian army and captured King Henry VI himself. This battle began what would later be called the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars that would ravage England for 3 decades and would see the Neville family play the most crucial and controversial role. Cecily stood firmly by her husband through these dangerous years, even as the political situation became increasingly violent. When Richard marched to London with an army, Cecily remained at their castles managing affairs. When Richard was declared Protector of England during one of Henry VI's periods of mental incapacity, Cecily enjoyed the reflected glory of being wife to the second most powerful man in the kingdom. And when Richard's enemies forced him to flee to Ireland to escape arrest, Cecily waited in England, maintaining the family's position and protecting her children. The crisis reached its terrible climax in December 1460 at the Battle of Wakefield. Richard, Duke of York, after returning from Ireland and attempting to claim the throne directly, rather than merely reforming the government, was defeated in battle by a Lancastrian army. Richard was killed in the fighting, along with Cecily's second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, who was only 17 years old. The Lancastrians, in an act of savage cruelty designed to humiliate the House of York, cut off Richard's head and displayed it on the gates of York City, crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions. The news of her husband's death and her son's murder reached Cecily as she was staying in London. The blow was devastating. In a single afternoon, Cecily lost both her husband of more than 30 years and one of her beloved sons. She was 55 years old, an age when most women of her time had already died, and she might have expected to live out her remaining years in quiet widowhood, respected for her past status, but removed from the centre of political power. But Cecily's story was far from over. Her eldest son, Edward, now 19 years old, inherited his father's claim to the throne and his determination to pursue it. In the spring of 1461, Edward led a Yorkist army against the Lancastrians. winning a series of stunning victories culminating in the massive and bloody Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461. This battle, fought in a snowstorm between armies that may have totaled more than 50,000 men combined, was probably the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrians were utterly defeated, with thousands killed in the battle and in the pursuit that followed. Edward IV entered London in triumph and was crowned King of England on June 28, 1461. Cecily Neville, the daughter of an Earl who had married a Duke, was now mother to the King of England. She received the title My Lady the King's Mother and was granted apartments in royal palaces, substantial income from lands, and the precedence and respect owed to the mother of a reigning monarch. For the next 22 years, until Edward's death in 1483, Cecily would be one of the most important figures at the English court. She advised her son on political matters, helped arrange advantageous marriages for her other children and grandchildren, maintained lavish state as befitted her position, and established a reputation for piety and dignity that earned her widespread respect. Contemporary sources describe her daily routine in her later years: hours spent in prayer and religious devotions, attendance at multiple masses each day, careful regulation of her household according to strict rules of precedence and ceremony. But Cecily also lived to see terrible tragedies continue to afflict her family. Her son George, Duke of Clarence, repeatedly conspired against his brother King Edward IV, and was finally arrested and executed in 1478, allegedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine in the Tower of London. The loss of another son to violence, this time at her surviving son's command, must have been agonizing for Cecily. When Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, at the age of only 40, Cecily faced yet another family crisis. Edward's son, the 12-year-old Edward V, should have inherited the throne, but Cecily's youngest son Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had served Edward IV loyally for more than 20 years as military commander and administrator, seized power in a controversial coup. Richard declared that Edward IV's children were illegitimate due to a supposedly secret pre-contract of marriage that invalidated Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and Richard himself was crowned as King Richard III on July 6, 1483. Cecily's role in this usurpation remains one of history's most debated questions. Did she support Richard's coup? Did she provide him with the information about the supposed pre-contract that justified disinheriting Edward's children? Or did she oppose Richard's actions, horrified that he would steal the throne from his own nephews? The sources are frustratingly unclear, and historians have argued every possible position. What is certain is that Cecily continued to live in dignity and comfort during Richard III's brief reign, receiving financial support from her son and maintaining her position as a grande dame of the royal family. When Richard was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in August 1485 by the forces of Henry Tudor, who claimed the throne as Henry VII and founded the Tudor dynasty, Cecily lost her third and final son to the violence that had consumed her family for decades. Cecily Neville died on May 31st, 1495, 80 years old, an extraordinary age by medieval standards. She had survived her husband by 35 years, had outlived all but one of her children. Her daughter Margaret lived until 1503, and had seen her family rise to the throne only to be destroyed by the same violence that had brought them to power. She was buried beside her husband Richard at Fotheringhay Church, and her tomb can still be visited today. Cecily's legacy was complex. She was mother to two kings, but one of those kings had usurped the throne from her grandchildren, and the other had been killed in battle after a reign of barely 2 years. She had lived through 3 decades of civil war that devastated England and killed thousands. Yet she had also maintained dignity, piety, and strength through all these catastrophes, providing a model of noble womanhood that contemporaries admired, even as they deplored the violence her family had unleashed. Of all the extraordinary figures the Neville family produced, none was more dramatic, more powerful, or more controversial than Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as Warwick the Kingmaker. This man would dominate English politics and warfare for 2 decades, making and unmaking kings with his military power and political cunning, until his ambition and his recklessness led him to destruction on a bloody battlefield. His story is essential to understanding both the Neville family's greatest triumphs and their ultimate catastrophe. Richard Neville was born on November 22nd, 1428, the eldest son of Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and Alice Montague, heiress to the Salisbury earldom. Through his father, Richard descended from Joan Beaufort and Ralph Neville, making him Cecily, Duchess of York's nephew, and giving him royal blood through John of Gaunt. Through his mother, he would inherit the Salisbury title and estates, making him one of the wealthiest men in England even before his greater inheritance. Young Richard grew up in a world of power and privilege, educated in the military and political skills appropriate to a great nobleman. He learned to fight with weapons, to command soldiers in battle, to read the complex political situations that constantly threatened or created opportunities for noble families, and to manage the vast estates that would one day be his responsibility. He also learned the bitter lesson that his Neville grandfather had taught, that family unity was less important than personal advancement, and that ruthless pursuit of power was more valuable than loyalty to one's relatives. Richard's life was transformed by a marriage arranged when he was still a child. In 1436, when Richard was only 7 or 8 years old, he was married to Anne Beauchamp, who would eventually become sole heiress to the earldom of Warwick. Anne was the daughter of Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, one of the greatest nobles and military commanders of his generation. When Earl Warwick died in 1439, and Anne's older sister died without heirs, Anne became Countess of Warwick in her own right, and her husband Richard Neville acquired courtesy use of the title. This marriage made Richard Neville enormously wealthy and powerful almost overnight. The Warwick estates included castles and manors across England, particularly strong holdings in the Midlands and the Welsh Marches. Combined with his Salisbury inheritance and his Neville lands, Richard controlled resources that made him richer than many kings. With wealth came military power. Richard could raise thousands of soldiers from his estates, hire mercenaries with his abundant cash, and purchase the best weapons and armor available. But Richard wanted more than wealth. He craved political power, military glory, and the prestige that came from being recognized as the greatest nobleman in England. He threw himself into the factional conflicts of the 1450s, initially supporting his Neville relatives and the Duke of York against the corrupt favourites who dominated Henry II's government. Richard fought at the First Battle of St Albans in 1455, winning glory alongside his father, the Earl of Salisbury, and his uncle by marriage, Richard, Duke of York. As the conflict between York and Lancaster escalated into open civil war, Warwick emerged as the most capable military commander on the Yorkist side. He was bold, energetic, and willing to take enormous risks in pursuit of victory. At the Battle of Northampton in July 1460, Warwick's forces captured King Henry VI himself, giving the Yorkists control of the king's person and therefore theoretical legitimacy for their actions. This was the first of several times that Warwick would prove his ability to achieve victories that changed the political landscape. But Warwick also experienced crushing defeat. At the Second Battle of St Albans in February 1461, a Lancastrian army commanded by Queen Margaret of Anjou defeated Warwick's forces and recaptured King Henry VI. This defeat was humiliating for Warwick, who had boasted that he could hold the king secure against any attack. The loss might have destroyed Warwick's reputation, but he was saved by Edward, Earl of March, Cecily Neville's son and Warwick's cousin, who won a stunning victory at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross and then marched to join Warwick. Together, Edward and Warwick led their combined armies to the massive Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, where they destroyed the Lancastrian army in the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The victory was so complete that Edward was able to claim the throne as King Edward IV, while Warwick took credit as the man whose military genius had made Edward's kingship possible. For several years, Warwick effectively governed England, while Edward was learning to be king, and Warwick revelled in his position as the power behind the throne. Warwick's pride and ambition led him to overreach. He attempted to arrange Edward IV's foreign policy and marriage according to his own preferences, intending to marry the king to a French princess as part of an alliance with Louis XV of France. But Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful widow from a relatively minor noble family, and revealed this fait accompli to a humiliated Warwick in September 1464. The king's marriage to Elizabeth enraged Warwick, who saw it as both a personal insult and a rejection of his political guidance. The relationship between Edward IV and Warwick deteriorated through the late 1460s as Edward increasingly made his own decisions and elevated Elizabeth's numerous relatives to positions of power and wealth. Warwick, who had grown accustomed to being indispensable, found himself marginalized and disrespected. His pride could not tolerate this situation, and he began plotting to overthrow the very king he had placed on the throne. In 1469, Warwick allied with Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, who resented being passed over for power and wealth, and rebelled against Edward IV. Warwick raised an army, defeated a royal force at the Battle of Edgecote, and briefly captured King Edward himself. But Warwick discovered that holding a king prisoner did not translate to governing effectively. The realm descended into chaos, and Warwick was forced to release Edward and pretend that the whole rebellion had been a regrettable misunderstanding. Warwick tried again in 1470, this time fleeing to France after his second rebellion failed. In an astonishing diplomatic reversal, Warwick allied with his former enemy Queen Margaret of Anjou and agreed to restore her husband Henry VI to the throne in exchange for French support. Warwick invaded England in September 1470, while Edward IV was in the north dealing with a rebellion, and Edward was forced to flee to Burgundy as Warwick entered London in triumph and restored Henry VI to the throne after nearly 10 years of imprisonment. For 6 months, Warwick ruled England as Henry VI's chief minister, while the simple-minded king served as a figurehead. But Edward IV was not finished. Supported by his brother-in-law Charles, Duke of Burgundy, Edward returned to England in March 1471 with a small but determined army. Warwick gathered forces to oppose him, and the two armies met at the Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, fought in thick fog that created chaos and confusion on both sides. The battle was desperate and close fought. Warwick's forces initially seemed to be winning, but confusion caused by the fog led one part of the Lancastrian army to attack another by mistake. The Lancastrian formations broke apart, and Edward's forces surged forward. Warwick, who had usually fought mounted and in full armour, had supposedly dismounted and fought on foot to show his men that he would not flee. He was surrounded and killed in the fighting or the pursuit immediately afterward. His body left on the battlefield with those of thousands of other dead. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, died at age 42, having dominated English politics for 15 years and having personally made and unmade 3 kings, Henry VI, deposed in 1461, restored in 1470, Edward IV, crowned in 1461, deposed in 1470, restored in 1471. His ambition and pride had made him the most powerful subject in England, but they had also led him to betray the king he had crowned and to ally with his former enemies in a desperate gamble for power that cost him his life. Warwick left no male heirs. His only children were 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne, who would themselves play roles in the continuing drama of the Wars of the Roses. Isabel married George, Duke of Clarence, and died young. Anne married first Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's, and Margaret of Anjou's son, who was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury 3 weeks after Warwick's death, and then Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would become King Richard III. The vast Warwick estates were divided between these marriages, fragmenting the enormous power that the Kingmaker had wielded. Warwick's legacy was controversial then, and remains so now. To his supporters, he was a noble champion who fought for good governance and who was driven to rebellion by Edward IV's ingratitude and poor judgment. To his enemies, he was an overmighty subject whose pride and ambition destabilized the kingdom and whose betrayals cost thousands of lives. Modern historians see him as emblematic of the dangers of excessive noble power, a man whose military resources and political connections made him more powerful than most kings, but whose judgment was repeatedly clouded by pride and whose loyalty was always conditional on maintaining his predominant position. The Neville family's story of power and violence, which had reached its climax with Warwick, the Kingmaker's career in the 1460s and early 1470s, did not end with Warwick's death. The family continued through the Tudor period, surviving the Wars of the Roses and the establishment of the new dynasty, but increasingly marginalized and impoverished as successive monarchs remembered the Nevilles' history of rebellion and kingmaking. The family's final great act of defiance would come nearly a century after Warwick's death, in 1569, when Charles Neville, 6th Earl of Westmorland, would lead the last major Catholic rebellion against the Elizabethan settlement. To understand the rising of the North, we must first understand how the Neville family's position had changed during the century following Warwick's death. The Neville Earls of Westmorland, descended from Ralph Neville's eldest son by his first marriage, had remained relatively minor figures throughout the Wars of the Roses and the Tudor period. They possessed the title and some estates, but nothing like the vast wealth and power that had belonged to the Salisbury-Warwick branch of the family. Meanwhile, the Salisbury-Warwick estates had been divided among heirs and co-heirs, diminishing the family's consolidated power. The Protestant Reformation that swept England under Henry VIII and Edward VI, and that was consolidated under Elizabeth I, after the Catholic interlude of Mary I's reign, created new tensions in the north. The northern counties, Northumberland, Durham, Cumberland, Westmorland and Yorkshire, were more conservative in religion than southern England, and many northern families clung to the old Catholic faith, even as the official church became Protestant. The Nevilles, along with the Percys and other great northern families, maintained Catholic sympathies and resented the religious changes imposed by distant monarchs in London. Charles Neville was born around 1542, inheriting the earldom of Westmorland in 1564, while still in his early 20s. Charles was both ambitious and reckless, eager to restore his family to the prominence they had enjoyed in the 15th century, but lacking the judgment and resources to achieve this safely. He was a committed Catholic who resented the Elizabethan religious settlement that had made Protestantism the official religion of England, while theoretically allowing some private Catholic worship. In 1569, Charles joined with Thomas Percy, 7th Earl of Northumberland, in planning a rebellion against Elizabeth I. The rebels' goals were complex and probably not entirely consistent even among the leaders. Some wanted to replace Elizabeth with Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic queen who had been forced to abdicate her throne in Scotland and who was being held in England by Elizabeth. Others wanted simply to restore Catholicism as England's official religion while keeping Elizabeth on the throne. Still others had personal grievances against Elizabeth's government or hoped to profit from the redistribution of church lands and offices that might follow a successful rebellion. The conspiracy began to unravel in October 1569, when some of the plotters revealed information about the plans to the government. Elizabeth's ministers summoned Charles Neville and the Earl of Northumberland to London to explain themselves, a summons that both earls recognized as a trap that would likely end with their imprisonment. Facing a choice between surrendering to probable arrest or launching their rebellion prematurely before preparations were complete, the earls chose rebellion. On November 14, 1569, Charles Neville and the Earl of Northumberland raised their banners in rebellion at Durham. They issued a proclamation claiming that they were acting to defend the Catholic faith and to restore proper counsellors to the Queen, and they gathered an army of several thousand men, drawn from their estates and from Catholic sympathisers across the north. The rebel army marched to Durham Cathedral, where they celebrated a Catholic Mass in the great church, from which Protestantism had supposedly purged all traces of the old religion. The symbolic importance of this act cannot be overstated. Durham Cathedral, which had been saved from Scottish devastation by the first Ralph Neville's victory at Neville's Cross more than 2 centuries earlier, was now the site of the last Neville's rebellion against Protestant England. The rebels tore down the Protestant communion table, restored the Catholic altar, celebrated Mass according to the old rites, and burned Protestant prayer books. For committed Catholics, this was a moment of joyous restoration. For Protestant authorities, it was sacrilege and treason. But the rising of the North was doomed from the start. The rebels' military position was hopeless. Elizabeth's government commanded far greater resources than the northern earls, could raise larger armies, and controlled the machinery of the state. The rebels' plan had depended on support from Catholic sympathisers across England and possibly from Spain. But this support never materialised. English Catholics, remembering the failures of previous rebellions, chose to remain loyal to Elizabeth rather than risk their lives and estates for a rebellion that seemed unlikely to succeed. As a royal army under the Earl of Sussex marched north to confront the rebels, the rebel army began to disintegrate. Many of the common soldiers who had joined the rebellion realized that they were on the losing side and deserted, hoping to return to their homes before government forces could identify them as rebels. The rebel commanders argued among themselves about strategy, with some wanting to march south to free Mary, Queen of Scots from captivity, while others counselled retreat into Scotland. By mid-December 1569, barely a month after the rebellion began, it was effectively over. Charles Neville and the Earl of Northumberland fled north with a few hundred loyal followers, attempting to reach Scotland where they might find refuge. Behind them, Elizabeth's forces reoccupied the rebel territories and began systematic reprisals against those who had supported the rebellion. The government's vengeance was swift and brutal. Elizabeth ordered that hundreds of rebels be executed as examples to discourage future rebellions. Contemporary estimates suggest that as many as 450 men were hanged across the northern counties, their bodies left on display as warnings. The victims included not just leaders and active participants, but also many common soldiers, and even some who had merely been suspected of sympathy with the rebellion. The executions were carried out methodically, with martial law courts processing cases rapidly and executions following within days or even hours of conviction. The goal was not just punishment but terror, to make the cost of rebellion so high that no one would dare attempt it again. Property belonging to executed or fled rebels was confiscated by the Crown, enriching Elizabeth's government and impoverishing the families of the rebels. Charles Neville managed to escape into Scotland, where he lived as a fugitive and exile for several months. The Scottish government, under pressure from England and recognizing that harbouring English rebels would cause diplomatic problems, eventually forced Charles to leave. He fled to the Spanish Netherlands, where he lived in poverty as a pensioner of the Spanish crown, begging for support and plotting futile schemes for another Catholic rebellion that would restore him to his estates and titles. The Earl of Northumberland was less fortunate. He too escaped to Scotland, but the Scottish government captured him and, after prolonged negotiations, sold him to the English government for $2,000. Northumberland was tried for treason, convicted, and executed in York on August 22, 1572. His head was displayed on a spike as a warning, just as the heads of Charles Neville's ancestors had been displayed after battles in the Wars of the Roses. Charles Neville lived in exile for 32 years, dying in poverty at Newport in the Spanish Netherlands on November 16, 1601. He was about 59 years old and had spent more than half his life as an exile, separated from his estates, his family, and his homeland. His earldom was declared forfeit by Act of Parliament, officially ending the senior line of the Neville family. The vast estates that Ralph Neville had built up in the late 14th and early 15th centuries were dispersed among Crown supporters, and the Neville name, which had once been synonymous with power in northern England, faded into relative obscurity. The Neville family story, spanning more than 4.5 centuries from their first recorded appearance in the 1120s to Charles Neville's death in exile in 1601, is a remarkable tale of rise and fall, glory and catastrophe, ambition and destruction. Few families have climbed so high or fallen so far, and few have left such a deep imprint on England's history. The family's rise was built on consistent service to the Crown, military prowess, strategic marriages, and careful accumulation of lands and offices. Generation after generation of Nevilles demonstrated competence in administration and warfare, earning the trust of kings and the respect of their peers. The victory at Neville's Cross in 1346 established the family's military reputation. The marriage to Joan Beaufort brought royal blood. The political acumen of Ralph Neville, first Earl of Westmorland, secured the family's position through the dangerous transition from Richard II to Henry IV. But the seeds of the family's eventual destruction were planted during their greatest triumphs. Joan Beaufort's insistence on favouring her own children over Ralph's children from his first marriage created a fatal division within the family. The younger Nevilles of the Salisbury-Warwick line gained enormous power, but developed an arrogance and ambition that led Warwick the Kingmaker to betray and overthrow kings. The family's wealth and military resources made them a threat to royal authority, and successive monarchs worked to limit Neville power and to reward families more reliably loyal. The Neville family's involvement in the Wars of the Roses was both their greatest moment of national importance and the beginning of their ultimate decline. Warwick the Kingmaker wielded power that few subjects before or since have matched, but his betrayals and his death at Barnet ensured that future kings would view the Nevilles with suspicion. The family survived into the Tudor period, but never recovered their former preeminence. And Charles Neville's disastrous rebellion in 1569 provided Henry VIII's granddaughter Elizabeth III with the perfect excuse to destroy what remained of Neville power. Yet the Neville legacy extends beyond their political and military activities. Through Cecily Neville, the family's blood flows in the veins of English royalty to the present day. Cecily's son, Edward IV, had children who married into other royal families. Through various lines of descent, the Nevilles are ancestors of subsequent English, Scottish, and British monarchs, including the current royal family. Every king and queen of England since Edward IV carries Neville blood, making Joan Beaufort and Ralph Neville ancestors of the modern royal family. The Neville name also lives on in place names across northern England. Neville's Cross remains a district of Durham, commemorating the great victory of 1346. Other places bear Neville names or associations, reminding modern residents of the family's long dominance of the region. Raby Castle, Sheriff Hutton Castle, and other former Neville strongholds still stand, some as ruins and some still inhabited, physical monuments to the family's wealth and power. In historical memory, the Nevilles occupy an ambiguous position. They are remembered as great warriors, particularly the first Ralph Neville, who defeated the Scots at Neville's Cross, and Warwick, the Kingmaker, whose military exploits were legendary, even in his own lifetime. They are remembered as proud and ambitious, willing to risk everything for power and glory. And they are remembered as ultimately tragic figures whose ambition destroyed them. The Neville story offers lessons about power and its dangers, about the importance of family unity and the costs of internal division, about the relationship between subjects and rulers in a monarchical system, and about the unpredictability of fortune in an era when a single battle or political decision could make or break a family. The Nevilles rose from obscure Norman knights to become one of England's greatest families, married into the royal line, placed 2 kings on the throne, and dominated English politics for generations. They also betrayed kings, switched sides in civil wars, fought against their own relatives, and ultimately destroyed themselves through overreaching ambition. Today, more than 4 centuries after the death of the last Earl of the senior line, the Neville family has largely faded from public consciousness, except among historians and enthusiasts of medieval and Tudor history. But their story remains one of the most dramatic in English history, a tale of ambition and achievement, violence and tragedy, glory and ruin that illuminates the tumultuous centuries when England's nobility wielded power that could make or break kingdoms, and when the Nevilles stood at the very pinnacle of that power before falling into exile and obscurity. As our story of the Neville family comes to a close, we can reflect on more than 4 centuries of English history, seen through the eyes of one remarkable family. From the Anglo-Saxon origins of Dolphin holding land at Staindrop in 1129, through the military glory of the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, the political brilliance of Ralph Neville's marriage to Joan Beaufort, the pride and power of Cecily, Duchess of York, the king-making ambitions of Warwick, to the final tragic rebellion of Charles Neville in 1569. The Nevilles lived through and shaped some of England's most dramatic and violent centuries. Their castles still stand, their victories are still commemorated, their blood still flows in royal veins. The Neville name, once spoken with awe and fear across northern England, now belongs primarily to history books and to the few descendants who still bear the name in various branches. But their story remains, a testament to what ambition could achieve and what it could destroy in an age when power was won through warfare and lost through betrayal, when families could rise to touch the throne itself or fall into ruin with the turn of fortune's wheel. And now, as we leave behind the tale of the House of Neville, we can rest, knowing that their memory is preserved, their achievements recorded, and their place in English history secured forever. Sleep well and dream of castles and battles, of proud nobles and ancient halls, of a family that helped shape a nation's destiny.